Hola, muy buenas tardes. Muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Aquí estamos hoy para desarrollar el panel que hemos
Our panel today has to do with debates on autonomous, expanded, independent practices, both in Cuba and what is produced outside of Cuba.
Están hoy en esta mesa, en este espacio de panel, porque no hay mesa, pero es un espacio en torno al cual nos estamos juntando para conversar. Están aquí hoy
the person in the panel have contributed greatly with their work to expanding the possibility of driving transformation, social transformation through art, and in particular transformations within the space of art by breaking with disciplinary frameworks and introducing exercises of politicity, which are crucial to the transformation of thought and of the tools that we use to act on public space. I will present them briefly. Online, we have Tanya Bruguera. She's the reason why we are all here today. Thank you once again, dear Tanya.
Estamos aquí contigo y contigo en este espacio de INSTAR y por la necesidad de seguir pensando ese espacio que es nuestro, que es la isla de Cuba, y al cual deseamos todo poder regresar, ¿no? Y poder seguir haciendo cosas allí. Entonces, bueno, Tania Bruguera, para todo eso.
Tanya Bruguera is truly a well-known character. She really is a character. She does so much work, also outside the art context. She has deeply transformed the Cuban scene, and in two senses, as the artistic practice on the stage, but also as a political practice in the social field. And with INSTAR, they have done something extremely generous, inviting all of us here to get together, come together again, meet again after so many years. And it's a gift that we should be grateful for. Thanks to this, we are now able to reconnect and also meet people who we hadn't met before. And we are now able to know what people are doing in Cuba and outside Cuba, what people have been doing who we haven't seen since leaving the island, what Mariela is doing, what Nelda is doing, and other peers who are not here right now in the panel, but they are part of this encounter. It's interesting to say that we are going to be, the people who will be discussing here, some of us are living outside of Cuba and others are living in Cuba. And we all have different positions, or maybe the word is not positions. We work from different spaces. some people who are working from independent spaces, from institutional spaces, and people outside of Cuba who have continued to work. They have continued to develop what they first did in Cuba in a gesture of freedom. And it continues to be the case that their driving force is a concern for freedom. So they are looking for how to continue to produce and think outside of Cuba, disregarding all artistic parameters. So we are coming from different locations and places. El Ciervo Cantado is a theater group created in 1997. They have a space that we could say is connected to Cuba's Ministry of Culture. Their work, however, is deeply autonomous in thought and practice. Marianela Boán, for many people outside Cuba in Latin America and Europe, is a well-known pedagogue and a thinker about dance. In Cuba, her work was deeply received great recognition. She started doing what she called open dance in the late 80s. Then she left Cuba, and since then she has been working on what she calls contaminated dance, which has to do with working at the interstitial spaces. And Lynn Cruz, in 2011, she created Teatro Kairos. First, she was working as an actress, then she became a director, producer, and gradually she came to run into more and more trouble. Nowadays, she's completely marginalized, we could say. She has taken a radical stance with regard to power structures, the structures used by power to control and indoctrinate artists. So each of us will discuss how they are able to keep their work going, whether inside and outside of Cuba, how to sustain an independent and autonomous practice. When we conceived this panel, we were inspired by the ideas of the concept of temporary autonomous zone coined by Hakim Bey. And this concept is not about creating safe zones as we see it, or rigidly structured zones. We regard them as intermittent necessary spaces, provisional spaces, and Hakim Bey himself defined them as subversive spaces. He used an interesting metaphor, namely, he said there are not revolutionary spaces that then take control of power. They are subversive spaces which are always questioning and challenging power structures. So we find that this metaphor is very interesting. It allows us to think autonomy as a necessary pursuit which never becomes a safe space. We always have to fight and struggle for autonomy, and we always need to create new strategies. And all of the creators who are here today, uh, this is something that they are known for. They are always reinventing themselves. They continue to interconnect the past with the present. And it's impossible to define them. from within a artistic area. They travel between installation art, performance art, theater, the body art. So their work is connected to breaks in the in the aesthetic fields that come from the second half of the 20th century, which entails that it doesn't really make sense to speak in terms of individual disciplines. The last thing I want to say is that each of these creators is strongly informed by a theoretical practice about what they are doing. And there is also a pedagogical interest in contributing to future generations. They are and have been teachers. Marianela Boán and Nelda have taught several generations. And it's wonderful that in this space, many generations are coming together. All of us are so grateful to those who have come before and who have shaped us. And now we would like to try to continue contributing to shaping and, I would say, oxygenating spirit as we need to do to keep with our work. I have forgotten to say since yesterday, we are screening some videos shared by Sandra Ceballos from Espacio Aglutinador, an art space, independent space created in the 1990s in Havana, where work is exhibited, but it's also a space for artivist practice, we could say, which is concerned with how to develop political thought, and it's also a pedagogical space. Sandra Ceballos is yet another great teacher for many generations in Cuba, not only in terms of artistic practice, but also she has taught us a lot about how to create and struggle for life. Her work is very interesting because she regards independent and autonomous thought not only in Cuban art but also in Cuban culture. And we need to connect these things. We need to examine conversations between cultural spaces and art spaces in Cuba. So we're going to listen to these videos that Sandra has sent us. We're so grateful that she was able to take the time to send these recordings. And then we will talk to Tanya. Hello, my name is Sandra Ceballos. I am the founder with Ezequiel Suarez of the Autonomous and Independent Space Aglutinador. I'm going to say something odd. Nobody has said it before, but it's a reality. Independent art in Cuba, the first real independent endeavor in Cuba was the Paladares in the 1990s. They were private, clandestine restaurants. You would go to a restaurant in a person's house, you would go past the living room with the TV, and then walk into a small dining room with three chairs. That's where it all really started. All of a sudden, there were these clandestine paladars all around, and they were created independently. And this was one of the things that always surprised me, how they were able to step aside from the state apparatus, which controlled everything and still does. All of a sudden, there were also places like Reina Maria's rooftop, Victor Madera with his fourth wall at his house, we realized that people were starting to organize events, chats independently. And we said, well, at some point we will have to create a similar space for the visual arts. For all these reasons, the need to create, let's say, spaces that are free, autonomous, and which, and if we consider events during the last years of the 1980s, when censorship grew stronger, intensified, and many artists were imprisoned. I'm not going to name names, there were many, and I wouldn't like to leave anyone out. But many artists were sent to prison, they were detained, and also psychological harassment, and others were ostracized. They were set aside, and we thought this was very painful. Maybe they weren't artists who caused too much trouble for the authorities. We weren't ourselves, but maybe we needed a bit of air. We needed some kind of place, a space for tolerance and a safety. And we were still thinking of, at first, to just making our own exhibitions. We never thought that we would have something like a gallery and invite other artists. We never thought of that. We wanted to present our own work and maybe invite some people, but it wasn't conceived as a gallery. We didn't have a project. It was all done very spontaneously. It just sort of happened out of the blue. Even so, we were not quite organized. We didn't have a coherent approach. We didn't have aims, conclusions. We didn't have a written down project in the orthodox sense. It was very free, and it remains so. Myself, specifically, I have been summoned by government officials, people from the Ministry of Culture and Ministry of the Interior. I have been pressured. Ezequiel, not so much, because he worked with me during the first 5 years. And then Orlando Hernandez, I think is the name, he started to work with us at some point once we started to organize exhibitions a bit more regularly. And the team grew a bit. But as I have said, then we started to get a summons when the Havana Biennial was going to take place. However, ours has always been a democratic space. All kinds of artists can come, people even who are not artists, who want to be there, people from the neighborhood, people who are in urban tribes. They're always looking for a place to hang out. Our exhibitions always ended with a party. We would play rock music, which is the kind of music that we like. So it was very relaxed, very spontaneous. We worked rigorously during installation and organizing the exhibition, producing a catalog. We did all of that. We also organized birthday parties if during the exhibition it was maybe the artist's birthday. I think in a way it was other artists who started to pressure us. I mean, the artists who had been left out of the Cuban system for different reasons, not always political or other artists were marginalized because maybe they were a bit older, they were at home, they were artists, but they were not young, exciting artists. There was a bit of snobbery. Authorities were trying to pick the students, the young stars, and they would left older people aside. At that time, we ourselves were young, so I'm not saying that I'm not defending older artists because I'm older myself now. We were young, but we thought it was terrible how really good artists were set aside because they were not interacting with official institutions and they were not going to dinner with officials from the Ministry of Culture, and this is why they were set aside. So at the time when I started organizing exhibitions here, I also invited curators and I organized projects where I also questioned curatorial practice. We organized an exhibition called Curators Go Home. There were no curators. There was no age limit. There were no invitations to artists. Anyone could come and present their work, even if they didn't have a degree from an art school. People could come and set up their work wherever they wanted to. I was basically a sort of a guardian. I was also just looking over. Later on, what I call the paladars became proper and accepted private restaurants because there were so many of them, and the government didn't really have enough state restaurants to provide an adequate supply. So this all spread like a virus. The restaurants and coffee shops still in private homes, then small hostels where tourists would come. They created a mechanism. The government created a mechanism to bring all of these private initiative and legalize it um, by taxing them and creating a mechanism because it was clear that they could not prevent this from happening. So, but the most important thing is that nonetheless, when the restaurants became accepted, there were also other spaces like Riera Studio, other spaces that were very fleeting. They only organized 3 exhibitions. But these independent art spaces were never accepted or legalized as the restaurants were. We don't know. I imagine that now with 349, it will be very difficult to create a legal structure for our independent spaces. A few years ago, two important places have emerged. One of them is Tania Bruguera's INSTAR. She has allowed many artists to participate, artists who have been victims of repression. She has also transformed this into an absolutely democratic and radical place, which also works with artists from elsewhere in the world. It's a very active institute politically, and it has been greatly repressed. Many artists have collaborated. It started out gradually. At first, people were a bit scared, but now, with the wave of repression in our country during the last couple of years, it has become more and more important, and we artists are supporting INSTAR. Another case is the Museum of Silence, Museo del Silencio, created by Luis Manuel Otero, Amaury Pacheco Yanelis, and a group of artists, writers, intellectuals, also curators, journalists, people who have come to support this place. And as you know, Luis Manuel Otero is in prison now for all this. So this movement that began to gain strength about 3 years ago, it has been fiercely attacked by new laws like Law 349 imposed by the government in order to silence the voice of artists who are demanding change in Cuba. We need a new life because people are not living in Cuba. People here survive. Regrettably, I have to finish by saying that I don't really have a lot of hope in the possibility of new independent spaces emerging. Many artists and curators have left the island, the people who were doing work in their own homes, doing serious work and very engaged, committed to what is going on and the injustices that the Cuban government is committing. Everyone now can see what this government is doing, detaining people at home, blackmail, harassment. The government continues to unscrupulously deny these realities. And those of us who are here now, we are running a risk. At any moment, bad things may happen to us. And we are also very hurt by the fact that many people have been banished. They have been forced to leave the island. Artists, curators, also journalists, because independent journalism is also an important phenomenon. And the government media have done as much as they can to crush independent journalism. So we are here trying to survive and to resist. Espacio Aglutinador is going to start a new series of performance works. So if you have a chance to come to Havana, you might see some of the presentations. Uh, I cannot really tell you what the dates are because we need to keep it somewhat secret in order to survive. Thanks a lot.
Bueno, después de escuchar este testimonio, ¿sí? Después de escuchar este testimonio, creo que no se escucha. ¿Sí? Después de escuchar este
After
testimonio de
listening to
Sandra,
Sandra,
sabemos que todos
to
los
her
testimonios también
testimony, we
ponen el
know
cuerpo,
that
¿no?
when
Desde
you
el
give
territorio de
testimony, you lay
conflictividad,
your
además, no solo
body
en
on
ese
the
territorio,
line.
sino desde ese territorio de conflictividad. Pasamos a
Now
Tania,
we
creo que ha
should
sido
talk to
importante
Tanya. I
comenzar
think
con
it's
estas
important to
dos
start
mujeres que
talking
han sido
to Sandra and
las
Tanya
que han
because
abierto las
these
puertas
two women have
del trabajo
opened the doors for
independiente en Cuba, ¿no?
independent work
Sin
in
tampoco
Cuba.
volverlo
I don't mean to
excepcional.
say that
Hay
their
otros
cases are
ejemplos
exceptional.
también
There
de
are
trabajo
many other
independiente en
examples
Cuba
of
que no están aquí
independent
con
work in
nosotros en este
Cuba,
momento, como lo fue el
like
Teatro del
Teatro del
Obstáculo, ¿no?
Obstáculo, for
Pero que es
example.
importante mencionarlos por todo lo que representó el Teatro del
Teatro del
Obstáculo
Obstáculo
desde los
did
años,
really
desde
important work since
1985, cuando
1985
comenzaron haciendo
when
teatro
they
en una
started to
casa del barrio de
create
La Habana,
theater
hasta
works in their own
luego
house in
ese
Havana.
espacio ganado a fuerza de reconocimiento, ¿no? Y desde la institución siguieron ejerciendo un espacio de
And they remain
autonomía,
authentically
creación y
autonomous after
pensamiento.
they gain
Pues Tania, tú que has
recognition from the
sido la creadora
institutions to
de
their hard
espacios
work.
tan importantes
You,
como la
Tanya,
Cátedra
you
de
led
Conducta y
the
haberlo hecho
Cátedra
también
de
dentro del Instituto
Conducta, and you
Superior de
even did
Arte,
that,
que haber
created that
creado un
incredible space
ejercicio
within the government's
prácticas muy
art
reconocidas
institute.
como era la performance,
You
¿no?
introduced
En el
unknown
escenario artístico
practices
cubano
in Cuba,
y
like
toda la
performance
generación
art,
de
and you
artistas que fue
trained a
formando
generation of
y luego el
artists.
espacio que a
And
partir del
since
2015
2015, you
creaste con
created
el Instituto
the
Internacional de Activismo
Instituto
Hannah Arendt,
Internacional de
la
Activismo Hannah
cautiva,
Arendt,
y que seguirá
INSTAR.
haciendo tantas cosas con toda la fuerza que tú irradias. Adelante, un poco a
So
contar
please, maybe if you
desde
could
estas
share your
experiencias que tú has
experiences,
vivido, ¿no? Como, ¿qué ha sido para
what
ti
how
tener esta experiencia de
what has it
independencia
been
y
like for
autonomía
you
desde un espacio que
to
parece que te
work
permite
independently and autonomously in a
extenderte, ¿no?
country
Dentro de
where this
Cuba
is seems
incluso.
unlikely or
Bueno,
impossible?
primero que nada, las
Well,
gracias
first of all,
por
thanks for
invitarme
inviting
y
me.
por estar en un panel
I'm
con
so glad
gente
to be
que
part of a
obviamente yo
panel with
admiro
people
tanto.
who I love and admire.
Eh, yo voy a empezar narrando algunas cosas que me
I
sucedieron a
will
mí como
first
artista
share
joven.
some of
Yo
my
estaba todavía,
experiences
yo tenía que
as a
18
young
años,
artist.
16
I was
años o
maybe
algo así, 17
16,
años, ya estaba estudiando
17.
arte
I was an art student
y yo
and I
participé
was involved.
en momentos de ciertas
This was a
libertades
time where there was
donde,
a
por
certain
ejemplo,
degree of freedom.
recuerdo los proyectos
I remember
de Caridad
projects by Caridad
Martínez,
Martinez, for
recuerdo
example.
con
I think
danza
it was called
teatro, puede
Danza
ser.
Teatro.
Recuerdo
I
varios momentos, por
remember
ejemplo, en una
being, for
casa, no sé
example,
quién
in a
era, donde
home.
la
I don't
gente se
remember whose
reunía
home. People would
a
get
hablar
together to talk
de
about
lo que se
what
estaba haciendo en otros
the
lugares a nivel
aesthetic
como
innovations in
joven,
other
con
places
esa
of the
época,
world.
eso en los
In the
80,
1980s, as I
y no
recall,
eran
these were not
conversaciones
conversations
políticas, eran
about politics.
conversaciones
We were
sobre
talking about
estética, o sea,
aesthetics.
como las
We were
expansiones incluso que
discussing
tenía la
the
práctica a nivel
expansions
estético.
of practice at an aesthetic
Parte yo creo que
level.
lo que sucede con esta
Something
imposición
that
política
happens with
en la que tenemos,
this kind of
desde
political
estamos encerrados en
imposition
Cuba para crear,
that
es que
restricts
nos deja
everything in
frente a la
Cuba
posibilidad
is the fact that
de
it
transgredir
really
estéticamente,
impacts the
porque no solo
possibilities for
tienes
aesthetic
miedo por tu vida, no
transgression
solamente
because you're
tienes
not only
miedo
afraid for your life,
de hacer algo
you're
que
not
pueda
simply
traerte
afraid
consecuencias como
to do
carecer de tu
something that will
proyecto
lead
o que
you
te
your
metan
project
preso,
to be
pero
cancelled or shut
también
down or to
eso te va
be imprisoned.
condicionando
It
a la
conditions you
fealdad que tienen los
to the
dirigentes en
aesthetic
Cuba, porque
criteria of
desgraciadamente no tenemos
the
dirigentes cool,
directors
tenemos
in
dirigentes
Cuba because
shady,
in fact
de un mal gusto
the people who
horrible,
direct culture in
que se
Cuba have
creen
really bad
además
taste. They're
que por
tacky.
hablar
They
más de
think that because
reggaetón
they
son
think that they are very
mejores, que tienen
cultured
una
because
mentalidad blanca, elitista, racista,
they speak ill of
eh,
reggaeton. They are in
y
fact
clasista, porque
classist
ellos se
and
creen que
racist.
están en
They
otro
regard
nivel.
themselves
Y
as cultured
entonces
white
tienen incluso los
people,
gustos de ellos
and
tienen
so
un sabor que a veces
sometimes
después
their
se los come el
taste
viento,
is a
¿no?
bit
Que
nouveau riche. They're
de
uncool, they're not
inteligencia, de
smart, they
falta de
don't have
información.
information.
Entonces,
There are
hay
some
algunas
exceptions.
excepciones,
Some
¿no?
people have
Hay
been
gente que
there for a while
mantiene,
in
que
the
han estudiado.
institutions and they
Muy
have studied
interesante que
because
también en
it's
Cuba
interesting
la
that in
seguridad del
Cuba,
Estado ha hecho
state
algunas
security
investigaciones
has
en arte.
forced
Me
some of its
parece
agents
inteligente,
to
algo que me
study
parece
art.
interesante.
People need to study
O
art to be
ha
part of
captado
state
a personas que son
security and part
artistas
of
y
the
los han vuelto
cultural
incursionantes.
administration.
Eh, Quizás
And
para
these
darle
things
ese matiz
happen.
de que ellos sí
And so,
saben
because
hablar
they
de
need
cuestiones de que están
to
hablando,
present
que representan
themselves
filosóficamente
as
algo,
if they
etcétera,
knew what they were
que
talking
parte
about.
de esa camisa de fuerza que
So
tenemos
I
de
think
estética
that we
política,
also have
muchas
this kind of
veces
aesthetic
ellos para evitar
constraints because
hablar de
sometimes
política, porque
they
ellos
they
no
don't
les
like to talk
conviene y
about
tratan de
politics.
evitar hablar de política. No
They
hay
say
presos
that
políticos
there
en
are
Cuba,
no
son
political prisoners
delincuentes.
in
No
Cuba.
hay
They say
artistas
that there are
censurados por la
no
política,
artists
son
censored for
censurados por
political
criterios
reasons.
estéticos, ¿no?
They argue
Es
that
decir,
the censorship
ellos
is based
siempre
on aesthetic
buscan
criteria. So they're always looking for a way to avoid
relaciones
what they are
autoritarias de qué
really
está pasando.
concerned with.
Entonces, yo recuerdo en los 80 haber ido a casa de Osvaldo Sánchez,
So I
estar
remember
con
in the
algunos artistas de
1980s there
teatro,
were
algunos artistas de
artists,
cine,
filmmakers,
o por
theater makers.
ejemplo, a
I
fiestas a
remember
veces
also
que se
going to
hacían en la casa
parties.
de, no sé si era su casa, pero recuerdo, por ejemplo,
I don't know if the parties were
bueno,
at,
la gente de
you know,
teatro en los
the
80
people who work in
realmente había
theater
gente que
and
estaba
plastic
como muy
arts
adelante.
were on the
Había como una
forefront in the
energía muy
1980s. There
interesante
was
y
an
yo era muy
interesting
jovencita
energy.
y yo
I
sentí
was
esa
very young
energía
and
y una vez
felt
que
that
toda esa gente se
energy.
fueron de
And
Cuba,
once all of these people left
sentí la
Cuba,
ausencia de esa
I
energía y
felt
eso fue
that
lo que me
the
dio a
energy
mí el
was
deseo de
gone.
volver a
And
buscar
this led
quizás
me
una sensación
to
como
try
aquella
to
que tuve en
regain
los
that kind of
80,
feeling,
de
that sense
libertad
of
y
freedom.
de una
There
explosión
was a kind of
creativa, como lo
creative
mismo te sentabas
explosion.
al lado de
You
alguien
could
a
sit down
tomarte,
with
no
someone
sé,
to
un
drink a cup
café
of
y hablar de
coffee and
poesía y de ahí
talk
salir
about
un
poetry
proyecto
and come up
poético
with a project,
performativo
poetry
tú
performance
sabes,
project, or you would
colaborar con
collaborate with
músicos. Es decir,
musicians.
habría que hablar también cuando se
When
habla de
we talk about
independencia, de
independence and
autonomía, de la
autonomy, we should
independencia, la
always
autonomía
also talk
creativa,
about
no
creative
solamente en
autonomy and
términos de
independence,
temas
not
de
only
trabajo que
in
estén
terms of the
completamente
subject matter
cooptados por
that
el
the works
gobierno,
can
sino
be
también
about,
en términos
which is co-opted by
formales,
the
de la
government, but
forma, ¿no?
also in formal
Eh,
terms.
y
And
es
it's also
interesante
interesting
también
to
pensar
consider
la
the
evolución de la
evolution of
forma
the formal aspects of art,
que ha sido
which
aceptada, por
which
lo menos
forms
durante
have
los
been accepted and
63
which
años
have
de la
not
revolución.
during the
Al principio
63
tienes
years of the
PM,
revolution.
que es censurado
Early
por
on, you have the
un tema
film
de forma,
PM, which was
porque la figura
censored
y bueno, el
due
contenido
to its
también. Y
form.
después ahora, por
But
ejemplo, en la
nowadays,
práctica ves que
at
los
the art
artistas que están
school, you will
siendo
see that the artists who
reconocidos, sean
receive
buenos o no, no
acknowledgement,
estoy
I'm
hablando
not
de la
talking
calidad,
about whether they
son
are good or
artistas que
not,
tienen un tipo de
but
obra que
it's
no habla de
a
la
kind of
calidad. Es
work
decir,
that
trataron de
avoids
forzar a
reality.
los
So
artistas a
at
ser
first, they were
objetivos de una
forcing
calidad
artists to document
revolucionaria
revolutionary
a
reality, and now they
forzar
are compelling or
o
supporting
apoyar
artists
artistas que
who talk
hablan de
about
una
the
nueva realidad,
unreal,
hablan de un casi una,
who are really
una
disconnected from
desconexión con la
reality.
realidad, básicamente. Entonces, eso por un lado. Por otro lado,
On the other hand,
Sandra
Sandra at some
en un
point
momento
said that
dijo, porque no son artistas que iban a
she talked
comer con
about
los
artists who
funcionarios.
weren't
Creo
having
que esa es
dinner
una
with
cosa
a government
rápida que dijo,
official.
pero
She
que no
said it in
es un
passing,
detalle.
but it's an important
Desgraciadamente
issue.
en Cuba,
Unfortunately, in Cuba,
la libertad y la
the
autonomía
freedom and
de un
autonomy of a
proyecto a
project
veces pasa
sometimes is
por
conditioned by
lo
personal
personal.
relations.
A veces ellos
Sometimes
como que te
they
dan
kind of they regard you
confiabilidad,
as
¿no? Porque Cuba
trustworthy.
desgraciadamente no es un
In
proceso
Cuba, it's not a
meritocrático, no es un
meritocracy or
proceso
a
democrático,
democracy.
no es un proceso ni siquiera respetuoso de sus
It's not
tradiciones
even a process that is
culturales,
respectful of the country's
pero
cultural
a veces si
traditions.
eres
Sometimes
amigo,
you
yo
just make
recuerdo,
friends with
sin
one of
decir
them.
nombre,
I
artistas
remember
plásticos que
these
se
artists
iban
who would
haciendo
just try to make
amigos y iban
friends. They
regalándoles
would give
obras
works
e
to
iban
government
invitándolos a
officials. They would
fiestas
invite them
según
to
fueran
parties.
cambiando los jefes del
Uh,
Consejo de la Plástica. Y era
it was
casi
almost
ridículo, ¿no?
ridiculous
Era casi para burlarse, ¿no? Porque era de
because
repente, esa
they would
persona es
make
su
friends with
amigo y te
somebody
va a
if they
entregar
were
un
in the right
funcionario
institutional position, and then
en
they would
funciones, ¿no?
switch to someone else
Y esto también
when that
trae situaciones,
changed.
por ejemplo, yo tengo que decir
I
algo
want to
que
say something that I
básicamente
rarely say,
yo le
which is that
debo
I owe
en parte
the
ser
fact that I'm
artista
a
plástica a
performance
Elmo
artist
Hernández,
to Elmo
porque yo
Hernandez because I was
participé en un
involved in a
proyecto que
project
él
of
hizo en
his
Melissa,
at the ISA, the Art
no sé, quizás en el
Institute
año 80 y
in
algo,
1980 something.
que fue un
It
proyecto con
was a
muchísima
very
energía,
energetic poetic project.
creativa, estaba ahí Carlos Cendrán, estaba Miguel Salgado, estaba, bueno, Vizcaíno, bueno,
It
había
was a
como
whole
una mezcla de
mixture of
artistas
plastic
plásticos
artists and
con artistas
artists
otros
from other
que para mí
disciplines.
fue
And this was
fundamental,
really
¿no?
important for
Más
me.
allá de estas otras experiencias que iba viendo. Sin embargo, la ironía
However,
es que este
what is
proyecto que tenía
ironic is that
muchísima
this
libertad y se
project,
había hecho
which
desde una
had a lot of
institución,
freedom, although it was
no se hacía en la
made
casa,
within
no se
the
hacía en la escuela, se hacía
institution,
en la casa de un
it
muchacho que se
was not
llamaba
done
Eduardo,
at the school. It was done at, we worked
era
on
por ahí
it
cerca de la Plaza
at
de
someone's
Revolución.
house,
Y
close to
por ejemplo, es
Revolution Square.
irónico que la primera persona que me
Ironically, the
llama a mí
first
para
people who called
censurarme
me
es
to
Elmo
censor me
Hernández.
was Elmo
Y me
Hernandez.
llama en plan
And he did it
súper
in a
amigo,
tone being, you know, I'm your
Tania, te
friend.
quiero
I
ayudar,
want to help
estoy
you
aquí para
out. Here's a
conocer.
piece of advice.
Y yo creo que
And
eso
I think
sucede
this happens
mucho.
very often.
Ellos llevan toda la censura, llevan toda
The way in which they
más que
use
censura, a veces es
censorship,
como
or it's
el
not so much
sistema de
censorship, a
control,
system of
lo hace
control
también desde lo
that
personal en el sentido
is
que te sientes como que hasta sentir
embodied in
mal
personal
si
relations.
esta persona
You know,
fue mi
you're led to feel
maestro o esta
bad. You
persona
feel upset. This
ha
person was
compartido
my
conmigo en
teacher.
millones de lugares y
I
nos
get
llevamos
along
bien, entonces
with
ahora
him,
esta cosa
and
me
we
están
meet
haciendo daño a
everywhere.
mí
And then
porque tú
he's
estás
telling
haciendo
me that
algo.
I'm
Y ahí
hurting
también hay como
him
ese chantaje
for what
emocional
I'm doing. So there's a lot
en
of
todo este
emotional
proceso
blackmail
de
as a
control
tool for
estético y
control, for
conceptual
aesthetic and
de
conceptual
los
control
proyectos, de
over
las obras.
projects
Entonces,
and
donde
artworks.
tú
So
te
you
sientes como
feel
mala
that
persona, pues
you're
dices, ay,
being a
madre,
bad
pero yo
person.
tengo que hacer mi
You
obra,
say,
yo tengo
look,
que
I
registrar
need
un proyecto
to
de
do my
discos, yo tengo que
work.
seguir haciendo mi
You
obra,
feel that you're
pero
in
sabes que vas a
contradiction
perder un
because
supuesto
you will
amigo o le
lose a
estás haciendo
so-called
supuestamente
friend
daño a
or
alguien.
you're hurting
Entonces,
someone.
este sentido de
So you're led
culpabilidad
to feel
también a
guilty,
veces es
and this use of
interesante. Ya
guilt
cuando tú entras
is
a dialogar con
interesting. When
funcionarios
you
o la
talk
gente del sector de
to
Estado,
officials
cambia
or
esa
people from the
dinámica.
state
Y yo
security,
creo que es
it's a
que ellos
different
tienen como
dynamic.
una especie
I think that they have a kind of
de
a
sistema que se va
system that
incrementando
becomes more
en
intense,
cuanto a la
becomes increasingly
despersonalización del
depersonalized
proyecto,
as you
¿no?
go further up.
Y entonces mientras más
So if
tú
you keep
sigues insistiendo,
insisting and you keep
mientras
pushing
menos
on and you
aprendes,
fail to
entre
learn,
comillas,
quote unquote,
pues más violento y
then
más
they treat you
despersonalizada
more
es la
violently
reacción
and in
que
a
van
more
contra ti,
depersonalized
hasta llegar a
fashion.
decir quién eres y tal, aunque
At some
sea
point, they
mentira.
pretend not to know who you
Entonces,
are, even though they're
yo
lying.
creo que también hay otro aspecto, que es que yo creo que a lo que
What I
verdaderamente le
think they are
tienen
truly
miedo
afraid
el
of at
gobierno
the
cubano y el
Ministry of
Ministerio de
Culture,
Cultura y siempre, y ha sido heredado en los subsiguientes mandatos, ¿no?
with
Fidel,
Fidel, with Raúl, and
Díaz-Canel,
now with
es que le
Díaz-Canel,
tienen miedo
they
a
are
lo
afraid of
espontáneo.
anything
Y
that
le
is
tienen miedo. Yo recuerdo que
spontaneous.
una vez cuando yo hice el
I
programa
remember
con
at some
Marianela
point I was
Boán,
working on the
eh,
newspaper.
el, el del Consejo de
Some
la
guy
Plástica
from the
que me
Council for
estaba
the Plastic Arts
básicamente
who
amenazando que me
was
iban a meter
threatening me
presa
that I would be
por
sent to
15 años,
prison for
me
15
decía, aquí
years.
no te vamos
He,
a
he said to
permitir
me, we are not
que tú
going to allow
divida a la
you
gente.
to unite
Entonces
people.
ahí me di
That's
cuenta
when I
que no era
realized that
tanto lo que
it
uno
wasn't so
hace, de lo que
much,
ellos le tienen
they're not so
miedo,
afraid
porque yo
of
creo
what
que
you
hasta
do.
cierto punto a ellos
I
ni siquiera
think
a la gente del
that
Ministerio de Cultura le
up
importa
to a
todo lo que
certain
tú
point, they
haces,
don't care about
sino
the
que le
work that you
importa es
do.
qué puede
They're
suceder en el
concerned with
marketing
the
social
political and
después de
social
esa obra, cuál es la
repercussions,
consecuencia que puede tener. Entonces,
what the work can
este miedo a
produce.
la
So they are afraid
espontaneidad,
of
a lo que no
spontaneity, they
está,
are afraid of
digamos,
something
ya
that is not already settled and
decidido,
prescribed.
escrito, es lo que muchas veces los hace
And
a
this
ellos
is what
decidir, no, si un
often
proyecto
leads
no
them
se
to
va a dar.
decide
Y
whether
también creo que es
they let
parte
a
de lo que
project be
hace que
produced
aquí
or not.
no
And this is
sea
in
una
part why they are
forma,
so
una
afraid of
forma
performance art,
abierta
because
donde
it's
se
a
pueden
very
colaborar
open art
cosas a último
form
minuto o
where
incluso
you can
mientras está pasando
incorporate
el proceso.
last minute
Yo
things or
creo
even
que
something that
entonces aquí hay
happens
una
as the
tensión
work
muy
is being
grande entre
realized.
lo que
So
está
there is a
definido
difference
y lo que
between
está
something that is
indefinido.
definite and something that is
Y entonces
indefinite.
creo que eso es lo que ha pasado con la idea de la institucionalidad. Porque, por
And
ejemplo, es
this concerns to
interesante que Sandra hace una
institutions. It's
galería. Yo
interesting.
primero tuve
Sandra
una
created a
escuela,
gallery. First, I
ahora
had
estoy
a
haciendo un
school.
instituto.
Now, I have
Y
an
si
institute.
hay en Cuba
So
como
in
ese
Cuba, there is
deseo,
a
yo tengo un
desire.
deseo
I don't think it's an
anti-institucional.
anti-institutional
Porque
desire.
fíjate que está lo que yo le llamo las
What we have are
para-instituciones,
rather
que es
para
una práctica que hemos
institutions.
hecho mucho los artistas,
Artists
donde estamos,
have often done
digamos,
this. We are
sustituyendo a las
replacing the
instituciones que
institutions
no
that don't
funcionan
work
bien
well, or
o
we're
diciendo
saying,
voy a
I'm not going
esperar
to
a que esto se
wait
arregle,
for this to get
voy a
fixed.
hacer
I'm
la
going
institución
to
como
create
yo
an
quisiera que
institution
fuera.
that
Y
I
quizás
wish
de
would
ahí la
exist, and
institución que existe pueda tomar
maybe
algunas
through that existing
iniciativas
institutions may
o ser
may
diferente, ¿no?
decide to
Entonces yo
change
creo
or
que,
become different.
por
So
ejemplo,
I
yo
think that
recuerdo
for For instance, I remember that when I was interrogated in 2015 with Kenya, who is the lieutenant colonel who handles my case, among other agents from the state
este otro friend
security,
de mi
because
casa,
there's quite a few,
me decía,
she
pero
would
¿por qué
tell them, why
instituto?
do you call it an
Pues mira,
institute?
no,
Why don't you call it
no le
something
pongas
else? Just
instituto.
don't
Entonces ya
call
yo
it an
entendía,
institute. And I
ya yo me di
realized
cuenta que a ellos lo que les
that they were bothered
molestaba
by
era
the
el hecho
fact
de acceder a
that
un
there was a
espacio de
kind of
institucionalidad
institutionality
al cual ellos se cogen
which they
todo el
claim that
derecho.
they
O
have
sea,
the sole right
ellos
to.
requieren el
They
derecho
have,
a la
they are only they
institucionalidad. Es
are
lo que
entitled
Tania
to
Bruguera hizo con la
create
revolución.
institutions. That's
Quitarle
what
la
the revolution
posibilidad de
has
crear
done. It
instituciones
has deprived
al resto
other
de
humans
los
from
humanos,
the
y
right
creo
to
que es por
create
eso que se convierte
institutions.
también
And
en
I
una
think that this
dictadura
is also
muchos
why they have
países
become.
de los que
It has
están
become a
dirigiendo, es
dictatorship.
porque
In
entonces
part
cortan
because this
la posibilidad que tienen los
makes it
artistas, los
impossible for
activistas, las
artists,
personas normales de
activists,
crear sus
normal people
propios
from creating their own
instituciones para
institutions to
crecer y
grow and
tener su
understand who
poder.
they are.
Entonces, bueno, más o menos
So,
eso
okay,
es
in
muy
broad
rápidamente,
strokes,
después seguramente en las discusiones vamos a hablar más.
this is what I wanted to
Y bueno,
say.
esto solamente se evidencia con el
This is
349,
now clear
donde
through
es
Decree
un decreto ley que
349.
significativamente es el
It's
primer
the
decreto ley
first
que firmó
decree
Leonel
signed
Kennedy
by
al
Díaz-Canel
acercar
after
la
he became
presidencia,
president, and
que
it's
es sobre
about
el arte.
art.
Luego fue
This
muy
is
llamativo.
remarkable.
Uno
You would
pensaría
think
que
that
fuera
it
hablar
would
de
be
economía o de otra
something
cosa.
having to do with the
Eh,
economy.
y
And
lo
what
más
is
llamativo es que lo
remarkable
que
is
habían
that
logrado espacios
people
como
who had created
aglutinador,
spaces
que
like
era
Aglutinador,
convertir el espacio
where they
público en
were
privado, no
using,
regulado,
they
perdón, el
were
espacio privado en
transforming their
público,
private
sin la
space into a
regulación que
public
tenía el
space
espacio
to get
público
away with the
de
regulation
las
from the
calles, de las
regulation of public
instituciones,
space.
es
This is
revertido por el
reversed by this
349. El
decree because this
349,
decree 349,
entre otras
among other
cosas,
things,
la, reclama el derecho que
claims
tiene
that
la
political
institución política
institutions have the
de
right
meterse en tu espacio
to
privado, ya que
step
tú lo has convertido
inside
en un espacio público. Es decir,
your
que
private
es la
space once you have
erradicación del espacio
transformed it
privado,
into a
básicamente.
public
Entonces,
space.
¿y por
So
qué?
they are
Porque ellos no
basically
quieren
eradicating
que uno
private
tenga
space because
no
they don't
solo
want us to
autonomía
have
e
not only
independencia, sino
autonomy and
también
independence,
que no
they don't
tenga
want
el
us to have the
derecho
right
a
to
crear
create
su
our
propia
own
institución.
institutions.
Entonces, bueno, yo
So
creo
I
también
think
que en
that
capitalismo y en otros
capitalism and
países
other
tampoco hay
countries,
ni autonomía
there
ni
is also neither
independencia.
autonomy nor
Quizás
independence.
no son a nivel
Maybe
político,
it's
quizás son a niveles económicos, a
because of
niveles
economic reasons rather than
políticos tal vez, o de
political
tercera
or
generación,
third generation
como, ¿sabes?
political
Discursos que lo
issues.
políticamente correcto. Es decir, que no creo que el arte
So
pueda ser
what I'm
completamente
trying to
libre ni
say is that I
completamente
don't think that art
autónomo en
can
ningún
be
lugar.
completely free or
Lo que la
autonomous anywhere.
diferencia es
The
que en
difference is
otros
that in other
países
countries,
tú puedes
you
crearte
can
tu propia
create your own
nicho
niche
y tú puedes
and you
crear algo que a mí
can
siempre
create
me pareció
something that
muy
I've
chulo. Tú
always
puedes
found
crear
very
tus
interesting.
propios,
You can create your
tus propios
own
sistemas de
system for
evaluación
evaluating
de la
your
práctica que estás
practice,
haciendo,
your
tu
own
propio
system
sistema de
for
reconocimiento
acknowledging and
y de
legitimating
legitimación de
your
tu práctica.
practice.
Es decir, tú puedes hacer una
So
cosa que
you can do something
formalmente
that is formally wrong,
desvalijada,
something
loca,
crazy, something
irreconocible,
unrecognizable,
pero tú
wild, but
puedes
you can
crearte un
create a
sistema,
system
ya sea a
through
través de
your
tus amigos,
friends
a través de tus
or
congregaciones,
through a
etcétera, para
theory
tú
to
legitimar lo que estás haciendo,
legitimize what you're
que en
doing.
Cuba
And
eso
this
no
is
se
not
puede hacer. El
possible in
único
Cuba. The only
legitimador
source of
es
legitimacy in Cuba
el
is the
gobierno.
government.
Muchas gracias, Tania.
Thank you,
Retomando
Tanya.
rápidamente tres elementos,
So to
insignias
sum
que tú
up,
planteabas
you've brought up
para
three
dar paso
important
a Lynn
points.
Cruz, y sobre todo esa insistencia que tú has hecho en cómo los descoloca, ¿no? Lo
You have
imprevisible, ¿no?
noted
Lo que se
that they
torna
are really
imprevisible
upset
para ellos
by the
es muy
unpredictable, the
descolocador, ¿no? Y los
unpredictable.
asusta. Y tiene que ver también con esa
And this
imprevisibilidad y esa imprevisibilidad que
unpredictability
sale de los propios
is
espacios de
proper
creación
to
artística,
artistic
¿no? Tú
spaces.
has sido impulsora
You
de
have
dos
promoted
estrategias,
two
podríamos decir, que trabajan
strategies, we
esencialmente
might
con lo
say,
imprevisible y lo no
that
matrizado,
basically work
que es
with
la
the
dimensión
unpredictable,
performativa,
namely the
lo
performative.
performativo propiamente, más que la performance, me gustaría
I
decir,
distinguish
y por otro
performance from
lado el activismo, ¿no?
performativity.
Que tienen que ver
And
con
then
acciones,
activism, which also
prácticas,
has to do with
ritualidades que se
actions
colocan
and
y se
gestures
inscriben en el espacio
that
social, ¿no?
inscribe
Y eso,
themselves in social
trabajar desde
space.
ahí,
And to
estéticamente
do
trabajar
aesthetic
desde ahí,
work
es
from those
trabajar
two
desde la
strategies
imprevisibilidad. Es
is
decir,
basically
desde
to
eso
work with the
que el
unpredictable.
propio pensamiento Michael Kirby planteó como lo no matrizado, ¿no? Lo que no puede ser de alguna manera
What cannot, you're working with
estructurado
something that
y
cannot be
previsto del
foreseen
todo.
and
Por otro
structured.
lado, el
On
elemento
the
de
other
la
hand, you've talked
apropiación
about the
institucional
appropriation of the
es
institutional.
es cómo voltearle
So
las
how to turn the
estrategias, ¿no?
tables
Me
on them.
parece
strategically, what strategy really confuses them. And so this idea of appropriating institutionality, and there's something else that we were talking about yesterday. We saw it in the work that Lynn and Miguel presented, and we see it in other practices. Let's say something like the police drama, police dramatics, how the kind of police work, how the actions of the police, how we can again speak back to them from the space of aesthetics. I think that's the space of art. So many theorists like Mikhail Bakhtin and yourself have argued that artistic production is always ethical, that you cannot really separate an aesthetic gesture from ethics. At this point, I would like to ask Lynn if she could tell us about her experiences. If you would share some crucial moments of your young life, you're the youngest of us. You have the gift of youth still. You have lived the less, or you have the more to live, maybe. It's amazing what Lynn has had to deal with. Nonetheless, I'm really interested. I would be really interested if you could explain. For example, you have said that I would like you to tell us about your work, patriotism, when you work with the children of dissidents and human rights defenders. I was thinking about all of these children scattered throughout Latin America, the children of people who were in the left wing and who fought the dictatorship. It's always been very difficult uh, for this kind of struggle to acknowledge, because this is a dictatorship that Latin American lefts won't recognize as such.
Eso y algo que tú has dicho también, Lynn, que es que en las redes sociales que todo el mundo anuncia lo que va a hacer.
You have also said that although in social media people always announce what they are going to do, you cannot do that. You always have only to use the social media to present what you have already done. So explain these sort of clandestine strategies that you have used. Well, thank you for inviting me. I think this is the first time that I am together with with other human peers who I respect greatly, from whom I have learned so much. Many ideas mentioned by you, by Tanya, by Sandra. For me, the experience of doing theater outside the institutions has been so strange. I heard you speaking, and I thought someone once said in a lecture that to create a theater group is like founding a country. I always had issues when I was in theater groups in Cuba as an actress. Eventually, I realized that something was growing within me, something different. I began acting as an amateur. I was part of the amateur movement. That's been my perception. So my sense is one of living for art rather than living through art. I think that this is the first time that I can bring my work out of Cuba, present it to the world, and to experience what it is like for my work to be seen from outside. Because when you're inside, you're sort of recycling from yourself. And so I have discovered that, for example, the works that I have produced they're not really cool. They're outside of e- every system. So my experience is thanks to spaces like INSTAR, which support free art. So I have had the chance to present my work there. Not only there, but right now we are at INSTAR Square in Documenta, so I should mention them first. They have played such a crucial role for independent art during the past few years.
Y entonces, bueno, decía que con relación al teatro, yo no he querido traicionar, a pesar de
So,
que yo
with
sabía
regard to
que, por ejemplo, en
theater,
Cuba, como ya los procesos de, vamos a decir, de la
although I was
perestroika, incluso
aware, I
empezó
knew
el
that,
mundo que cuenta, por
for
decirlo de la
example,
manera
processes
más
like perestroika
cruda,
had already taken
es porque
place,
Cuba no importa,
but
no importa cómo nos sintamos
it,
los cubanos,
it
porque
seems like
sencillamente
it
ya
doesn't
el
matter
mundo
what
pasó por ese
Cuban people
proceso y
feel
nadie quiere
because the world
volver
has
a
already
discutir
gone
lo que
through
ya se
this
discutió, lo que
fall of
ya todo el mundo sabe,
socialism.
pero que en Cuba sigue
So
pasando.
people
Entonces,
don't want to talk
yo
about
vi
it
esa
because
contradicción. ¿Cómo voy a
it
negar lo
still
que yo
happens in
estoy
Cuba,
sintiendo?
but
Porque
the
a mí
world
me
is
están pasando
over
estas
it.
cosas. Esa es mi
But that's
realidad.
what I
O sea,
want to
si
talk
el mundo
about
no le
because
interesa
that's
nuestra
my
realidad, entonces
reality.
el mundo
And
está
if the world doesn't
mal,
care about our
porque es muy
reality,
diferente
then the
completamente
world is
a
wrong
esto que
because
estamos
it
viviendo
is
en este país,
completely
que es
indifferent
bastante
to what is
duro,
happening in this
específico,
country, which is rough.
y bueno,
It's very
alguien
unique,
tiene que narrarlo.
and somebody
Y
has
el
to
teatro
narrate it.
es como la
And to do it
responsabilidad
through
de
theater,
representar
well,
ese
then
mundo
it's our
aparentemente
responsibility to represent this
invisibilizado
invisibilized
por la
world,
institucionalidad, por el
invisibilized
Estado,
by
o
the
sea, con toda
institutions
la
and the
mala
state.
intención. Y entonces, bueno, es cómo
And so then the
sobrevivir
question is,
a
how
estos
can I
tiempos de
survive
dualidad
this duality?
para llegar a ninguna parte porque no
Going
tenía para
heading
dónde más
nowhere,
poner
because
esas
what am I
obras,
going to
o
do
sea,
with
dónde las
this
voy a
place? Where am
colocar,
I
no,
supposed
no hay,
to
no hay
put
mundo
them? There
posible
is no
para este
world
teatro.
for the theater
Pero
that we
bueno,
are
yo
making.
dije, voy a seguir haciéndolo
But
porque
then I
es lo
said
que
to
siento
myself,
y,
well, I'll keep
y,
doing
y,
it
y,
anyway
y de
because
pronto
it's what I
como una terapia,
feel.
¿no?
And
Tampoco
maybe it
puedo
was
ir
kind of like a
a un
therapy. I
psicoanalista
also can't go to
porque
a
no tengo la
psychoanalyst
posibilidad, voy a seguir
because
haciendo
I
mi
don't have
teatro
the
y pensé en
means.
eso
So
y
I
dije,
will
bueno, pues
use
lo hago por
theater as
terapia, si
therapy
me sano, ¿no? Me voy
and
curando.
try to
Y
heal.
bueno, así fui haciendo
So
porque,
this is how
como
I did
hablabas de
it.
nadie, para ya aterrizar ahí mi gran paréntesis, eh, con nadie yo viví, vamos a decir, en mi propia piel
So
lo
with
que antes
Nadie, I
era
experienced
una
in my
realidad
own
virtual,
skin something
que
that
es el
was kind of
mundo de
virtual
los
reality
opositores
before, which is the world
y
of
los,
the
bueno,
people
más
who
bien los
have been in
opositores,
the
porque ni
opposition.
siquiera yo no me considero ni opositora, me considero
I don't
disidente,
regard myself
pero
as
bueno, de la
an
manera que me trataron, me
oppositor or a
trataron como una
dissident,
enemiga
but I was
pública, ¿no?
treated
De ahí que
like
venga la
as a
obra
public
Enemigos del
enemy.
Pueblo.
And
Pero
that is
claro,
why
de
then I
nuevo,
created the
hay
work,
muchas
The Enemies of
Cubas,
the
muchas
People. But
revoluciones
there are
cubanas,
many
o sea,
Cubas,
para
there are many
cada
Cuban
cual tiene, eso es,
revolutions.
vamos a decir, fue como la
I
gran
would
obra de
say
Fidel
that
Castro,
was
fue
Fidel
eso,
Castro's great work.
esa,
He
esa idea de
imported
revolución
he
cubana
exported this
en
idea
la
of the
cual,
Cuban Revolution.
a ver, yo me siento
I
parte
feel part
también
of that
porque
because I was a
imagínate, mi padre
pioneer
militó en
girl.
el
My
Partido
father was in
Comunista,
the Communist
un
Party.
revolucionario, o sea, peleó en las
He
guerras de
fought
África,
in
o sea,
Africa.
¿cómo
How
dejar
can you
partir de esa
distance
infancia?
yourself
Es
from a childhood
imposible para
like
mí,
that?
yo no puedo
It's
renunciar a
impossible.
ser
I
quien
could
soy.
not renounce being
Y
who I
entonces,
am.
bueno, nadie, como
So
viví una redada policial por
this
primera
work,
vez bajo
Nadie,
seguridad del
led
Estado
to
para
the first
impedir que
police
se proyectara
raid
una
that I
película, o sea, a
experienced.
dos
It
cuadras
was a
de mi
film,
casa,
and they
de nuestra
were
casa,
trying
o
to
sea,
prevent
porque,
the
o sea, el
movie from
director era Miguel
being
Coyula, que es mi
screened.
compañero, éramos nosotros dos,
The film was
y de
produced by
pronto
myself
teníamos
and my
las
partner
calles
Miguel Coyula.
cercadas
All of a
para impedir que
sudden,
se pusiera la película en
they
casi la
closed
Galería del
all of
Círculo,
the
que dirige el
streets
artista visual
surrounding the
Luis Crapa,
space where we were
que
going
también es un
to
proyecto
present the film.
independiente,
It's also a
autónomo,
space run
que hasta ese momento funcionaba
independently
y
by
podía
an
exhibir sus
artist.
obras, pero con él
And
documentado
after this
fue como un parteaguas
situation,
incluso
our friend
para Luis,
Luis,
¿no?
who ran the
Que
space, he
lo
was
abandonaron
also
completamente y por
completely
mucho tiempo
cancelled, and
no pudo
for
saber
a long
nada de su
time
casa.
he
Y
could
claro,
not.
fue también que la figura de Fidel Castro,
And it was because
como el poeta
it
Rafael
had
Alcides,
to
que es
do
el
with
protagonista,
the figure, how the
tiene un
figure of
estilo
Fidel
que
Castro
fusionó una
was treated in
generación
the film.
y es una
The
autoridad en
poet
el sentido
Rafael
mismo de
Alcides
Fidel, que
in
habla
our
de una
film,
persona que luchó contra la
uh,
dictadura de Batista,
who
la
is
misma
part of
dictadura contra
Castro's
la cual
generation
luchó
and
Fidel
who fought
Castro,
with Fidel
que fundó
Castro,
el
and he was
Banco
an
Nacional de
important
Cuba con el
figure who
Che Guevara, o
founded
sea, estamos hablando de
the
alguien que
Cuban
tuvo
National
diálogo
Bank
ya
with Che
como
Guevara. So this is
internacional.
somebody from their
Y
own
claro, esa es
generation,
la razón de
and
nadie, ¿no? De por qué fue.
it's
Lo
what
que
he has
pasa
to
es
say
que
about Fidel
ahí se
Castro in the
estaban
film,
jugando varias
which
cosas. Se
really
estaba
upset
jugando
them.
no solo la producción
So it was not
independiente,
only an
sino también el
independent
derecho al
production, but
contenido,
here it
porque si
was a
tú no me
right
das
to
fondos, yo no
discuss a
puedo hablar
certain
de lo que yo quiera.
content. Since we
Y
didn't
también
have
se
any
estaba jugando
funding,
el
we could
tema de la
discuss whatever
exhibición.
we
O sea,
wanted.
tú no me das tu cine, yo sé que esta película no va a encajar
I
en
said,
muchos
okay, I
espacios,
know
pero
that
yo me
this
gusta el
film
cine.
doesn't match
Y
your
esa es mi
profile, but
derecho
I'm going to
como,
do the film
como
that I
artista,
want
como
to
creador
do.
independiente, vamos a
That's my
decir.
right as an independent
Habían
creator.
tres tipos de acciones políticas se
So
reunían, ¿no?
three
Esas son
kinds of
cosas que, bueno,
political
uno
action
empieza a
came
analizar, pero al
together.
principio
You
tú no
only
piensas mucho,
realize
pero
this
entonces después
later
te
on. At
confluyes y ya
first, you don't think
después
about it. You're
te
sort of
sueltan
in the flow.
las redadas
After the
policiales que
police
tú
come
dices,
to
mira,
raid you, then
¿qué
you
está pasando
say,
aquí? Tengo
wait,
que
what's going on?
combatirlo.
And you
En
try to
fin, que ya
reflect.
esa experiencia cambió mi vida
So that experience
completamente
completely
por
changed
eso,
my
porque ya
life
dejó de ser un espacio
because
donde
after that,
vamos a decir, la
police
represión
repression,
policial, que claro, en nuestro
sure,
caso
in
fue
our
mucho más lejos
case,
porque
it
nosotros
didn't
no
go
íbamos
further
más
because
lejos.
we
O sea,
didn't go
nosotros nos
further.
dijeron, no puede, y
They
nosotros
told
pues
us
dijimos,
stop
ahora,
and we
¿qué tal
stopped.
si nosotros
But
hubiésemos
what
dicho,
if we
nosotros
had
vamos a
said,
pasar a la historia,
no, we're
hubiera sido
going to,
distinta? Yo creo que
it
es una
would have
cuestión
been
de
different.
límites.
There
Tú
it's
mismo
about
como
limits, right?
ciudadano o
You,
como
as a
artista,
citizen,
tú
as an
dices, mi
artist,
límite es este,
you
porque
realize
yo
what
lo
your
que quiero
limit
es
is.
esto.
This is my
Entonces,
limit because
es
this is
como
what I
artista, tú
want.
haces tu propia
So
barrera
if you set up your
y
own
el poder
barrier, then
establece
power
también,
also
o sea, como el freno. Es
situates
eso,
the
es una
brake.
cuestión de
It's
acción, hasta
something
dónde tú
like
llevas
that.
tu
It's
acción.
about how far
Y
do your
entonces,
actions go,
ya a partir de ese
and
momento
then
que empecé a
from
tener
that
todo
point
eso,
onward, after
me empezaron a pasar las
things
cosas como una
started
película, así que te
happening
pasa
to me,
así,
it was like a
porque
movie
nadie quiere admitir que vive en un país de basura,
because nobody
simplemente.
wants to
Nadie quiere aceptar
recognize
que
that
de
they
eso
live in a
estamos
garbage
viviendo todos,
country.
que éramos cómplices
We
de
were
eso. O sea, eso no es
complicit in
fácil
that,
de
and it's not
aceptar, eso
easy
no,
to
tampoco
accept
es fácil de
or to
remediar, porque no
remedy
está en tus
because
manos
it's not
tampoco.
really in
Entonces,
your
¿cómo
hands.
lidias
So,
tú
how
con
do you
esas
deal with that
realidades? Y
reality?
yo dije, bueno, lo único que
And
yo
I
tengo es
said,
el
well,
teatro.
the only thing that I have are theater
O
and
sea, es la única
writing.
manera que tengo
These are my sole
de
means
por lo menos
for
expresarme.
at least expressing
Y
myself.
bueno, ya, ahí continúa, ya empiezan los
So, this
enemigos.
is
Yo
when we
creo que
started
sí,
to
ya
work
es
on the enemies of the people.
como ir hacia transgredir los
So, here
límites,
we are trying to
por lo menos
transgress
en
these
contenido,
limits,
y
at
luego
least in terms of
volver otra vez a repetir
content.
el círculo por una cuestión, vaya, casi de honor.
And we wanted
Hay
to
que
do it
volver allí.
again in the
Lo hicimos ahora
space
para
where
los
we were
espectadores. Y así hemos
originally
seguido
prevented from screening the film, and
trabajando.
we
Yo
presented it there.
pienso que
It
hemos
was a
llegado
matter
hasta
of
un buen
honor to
lugar,
do it there.
porque
We
el
did it
grupo no
for
puede
only
tener
4
un espacio
friends.
estable ni un
Our
sistema de
group cannot
producción
have a stable
en
space or a
en
stable
Cuba en
system
este
of
momento
production.
como
This
es.
is
O sea,
impossible
y
now in
es una
Cuba.
suerte que ya podamos tener 4
We're
obras
lucky.
en, qué sé
We're
yo, no
fortunate
sé,
that we've been
no
able
es
to
nada,
produce
¿no?
4 plays in
Pero
11 years,
bueno,
which is really not
sí,
much. But
lo que pasa es que con el teatro
the
yo
thing
tengo una
is that
relación casi como de
uh,
responsabilidad,
I
¿no?
feel a
Porque
kind
es
of a
como ver
responsibility
qué
for,
cosas
in
anteceden
terms of theater,
y a
it's a sense
pesar
of
de todas esas
responsibility.
realidades
I
han
have to
podido
consider my
mantener el
forebears,
teatro cubano
people who,
vivo,
in
¿no?
spite of
Y
all
tú
of
dices,
these
bueno, ¿qué vamos a
difficulties,
hacer? Dejar
have been
que
able to keep
lo
Cuban
eliminen,
theater
porque vamos a
alive,
eliminar todo, o sea,
and we have to
no hay otra,
prevent them from
sí, que no
eliminating
veo
it. But
ninguna
because what I
voluntad
think they want to do is
de que
eliminate it
haya
all.
un, de que vamos
I don't
van a
think
seguir
that they are
apoyando el
going to
arte,
continue to
no.
support
La
art.
señal es, búscatela como puedas, ahí tienes el teatro y
What they
búscate
seem
ahí
to be trying to say
tus
is,
fondos
you
y
figure out how you can
bajo
do it.
mí,
I will
¿no? Yo soy
surveil
tu
you,
jefe.
but you
Y esa
figure
es
it
la señal que
out.
están dando. Entonces, bueno,
That's the
para
signal that I
mí,
think they're
yo de esa
sending.
forma no quiero hacer
And
teatro,
I don't want
simplemente
to do
y
theater
seguir
that way, so I
haciéndolo
will continue to do it
así de manera alternativa, por lo menos para
as an
poder seguir
alternative
hasta que cambie la
until
realidad, ¿no?
reality
Si no cambia la
changes. And
realidad
if
del país, no
the
cambiará mi
country's
forma de
reality
crear,
doesn't change,
sencillamente
my
porque
way of
he
making
aprendido
theater will
incluso
not
a
change.
vivir de esa forma,
I have even
a,
learned to live that way
a producir de esa
and to
manera,
produce in
a que
that
la
way
creatividad venga por esas zonas así
and
de
to
incomodidad, de riesgo. Entonces,
be
como
creative
es como que
through
eso se ha
risk.
vuelto, va a decir la
So this is
poética.
in a sense the group's
Y
poetics at this
entonces,
point.
sí, no sé, hablar de Cuba es
It's really
muy
difficult to
difícil
talk
porque
about
ahora mismo
Cuba
el país
because
está hecho
right
pedazos.
now the
Entonces
country
estamos
is
hablando
torn
como
to
de una tierra
pieces. It's like
fantasma y
a
yo creo que esa
ghost
figura
land.
magistral está
There's
siempre
a
en mi obra porque eso es lo que
ghostly
voy sintiendo en la
figure, and
sociedad.
this is always
Es como un país de
in my work.
fantasmas, entonces
I
es
feel that
como
we're a
estamos
country of
hablando sobre
ghosts,
como desde las cenizas,
and we
¿no?
are
Como de
kind
la
of like
basura, que es
talking out
yo
of
creo
the
que la
ashes
obra
and the
del
garbage. I
siervo,
think that in El
que también es
Ciervo's
una
work,
representación de
you
eso, ¿no?
also
Como un
see
país
that
que es un gran
the
basurero.
country is a huge
Y ya, o
junkyard.
sea, como dentro de ese basurero
And
que decía hace
inside that
rato, como
junkyard,
decía
as
Ernesto
Ernesto
Sábato,
Sabato used to say,
como en medio de un mundo tan
how in
terrible
such a
se puede, una
horrible
frase más o
world,
menos así,
I don't remember
se pueda
his
producir
words
belleza.
exactly, but
Y yo
you
creo
can
como que eso ha
produce beauty
sido
in such a
el
horrible
reto, ¿no?
world.
Como que en medio de todo
And I
eso
think that's
terrible,
what's crucial.
mantenerse
We're
uno
trying to
produciendo,
continue to produce.
sacando de donde a veces uno no tiene fuerza, no tiene energía, pero uno sigue ahí concentrado y diciendo, esto es lo que tengo que hacer y yo creo que
Sometimes we like
si
the
hago esto
strength,
y
but
si
we
sigo siendo
remain
completamente
committed.
autonomía, de
And I
alguna manera
think if I
dialogando con otros
continue doing it
cuentavientistas,
and I remain
con las personas
autonomous,
que tienen
I'm in conversation
otros
with the people
espacios, o
who
sea,
are
aunque
figuring out
no haya
their own
derecho a
way
reunión, como
to do
aquí que estamos
things,
reunidos,
although there
estamos
is
en una cosa,
there
caímos,
is
como
no
dicen,
right
¿no? En
to
Cuba.
gather as we
Entonces,
are doing here
nada, yo
now. We
solamente
have no
quería
right to do
terminar
this in
con el
Cuba.
video de lo que
So I wanted to close with the video that shows what happened to us when we presented Enemies of the People. This was our second police raid. And it's a sequel of that work, what we are presenting here in Documenta in INSTAR Square.
¿Sería posible poner nuevamente el video, sí, del enemigo del pueblo, por favor? Para que lo escuchemos, porque estábamos viendo imágenes, pero escucharlo es muy importante. Ya la pusieron. Es que no lo escuchamos. ¿Qué creen? Sobre todo la última parte. ¿Sí? A partir de que empieza... Bueno, igual. No, nadie como ya lo empecé.
Ahora sí.
¿Por qué la seguridad del Estado tiene que estar armado en mi casa? ¿Por qué tiene que estar asediado en mi casa? ¿Qué es esto?
Permiso, ¿no? Se pide permiso cuando uno pasa de eso. No, me pasa por encima, o sea, no hay educación. ¿Qué educados son? O sea, me parece, es algo tan denigrante. O sea, que quieren hasta pasar por encima de las personas, de los ciudadanos, siendo cubanos todos, que todos somos cubanos. Deberíamos sentir vergüenza. Eso es lo que ella va a mi casa invitada. No se puede. Ella va a invitar. No se puede. Hay que matarlo. Vamos a subir. Que hiciste algo malo, ¿no? Aunque no lo hayas hecho. No tengo mi carnet aquí abajo. No, nombre. No tiene nombre. Es decir, que ustedes tampoco dan su nombre. Delincuentes, entonces. Los delincuentes son los que se esconden. Las personas que tienen delito no tienen su nombre. Yo no tengo delito. Yo le digo a mi ciencia que es un delincuente. Que no va a su nombre.
Este video aparece en YouTube con subtítulos en inglés. Es censura.
This video can be found on YouTube with English language subtitles.
On YouTube with English subtitles.
Y no dejar entrar a personas que tienen libre circulación porque es un derecho nacional.
Bueno, qué bueno. Lo que me alegra es que todos los vecinos de
había visto ya hace unos meses y pensaba mucho en algo que me hace recordar cuando la cuarta pared se estuvo haciendo.
This reminds me of what happened when Teatro Obstáculo produced their work, The Fourth Wall, La Cuarta Pared. It's interesting that theater visibilizes how power structures organize themselves against art. Theater is also vox populi.
Que es parte de ese acontecimiento de las artes vivas, se está constituyendo desde otro lugar, ¿no? Porque
in this video, for instance, Lynn tells the police agents, somebody who saw that video was impressed by how Lynn, being an actress and citizen, is telling a police person in a way that we in our generation would not have dared to do. But then in the 1980s, right, Marianela, they wouldn't do this. They wouldn't surround the house with police agents to prevent a performance from taking place, right? Other things would happen, but so these structures that are really trying to choke everything. But then, on the other hand, civil society is also positioning itself in different ways. So let's talk about, again, the 1980s. You, Marianela, you, for our generation, your work was so significant. You work as a choreographer. and also elsewhere in Latin America, you were among the most important dance artists in the world. You introduced dance theater in Cuba, right? The work of Pina Bausch became known in Cuba through you, and then you went even much further. After leaving Cuba, you have been talking about contaminated art, and I would like us to share your experiences from that point onwards. How does contaminated dance express your spirit of freedom and protest? I'm sorry for the introduction. I have to leave because I have a performance. I am really happy to be here. I would have loved to have stayed here till the end. Um,
Claro que sí, ahorita te vamos a ver.
yes, we'll come see you now.
A ver, cuando yo oigo hablar a
When I
Lynn y
hear
estaba
Lynn,
conversando
and as when we were
Nelda,
talking with
Mariela y todo,
Nelda and
pues recuerdo
Mariela,
todo
I
viaje
remember our
nuestro,
journey.
que empezó, por ejemplo, Danza Abierta, que empezó
Danza
en el
Abierta started in
88, la
1988. There
crisis
was
que
a
hubo en esa
crisis
época,
back then.
que yo creo que
I
esta está
think that the
mucho
current
peor, o sea,
crisis
que
is much
ya no
worse.
hay, a ver, no sé cómo
I don't know
explicarlo.
how to
La que era
explain
una
it,
gran
but
crisis
it was a great
también
crisis back then as well.
y
I
recuerdo muy
remember
bien
very well
toda la cuestión de la censura,
censorship,
el
obstacles,
ser peligro, ser
reinventing
deportado,
yourselves,
no
the
poder salir
danger,
porque
state
te pueden matar,
security,
todo.
the
En música,
impossibility of leaving the
vivimos todo el
country.
tiempo
We
la necesidad de
experienced so much
presión,
anxiety
etcétera.
back then,
Pero
but
era
it was
como, era
different.
diferente. Yo no sé, como lo estoy viviendo
I'm not
ahorita,
experiencing what is happening now, so I'm not
hay un
sure.
momento que yo
But at some
decido ya
point,
después de
after
15 años o
15
más
plus
de estar trabajando
years
en esa situación, creando
working
obras, todas
under
las
those
obras que
conditions,
creé hasta el Chorus Perpetuum 2001, fueron obras totalmente
I was
contestatarias,
producing
pero
really
que
challenging
siempre yo
works,
me apoyaba mucho en una cosa que es
but I
la
always
polisemia del
relied
lenguaje
on the
danzario.
polysemy of the dance
Eres tú que me
language.
está diciendo eso. Yo no,
So I would
eso no
say,
está
well, that's your
diciendo
interpretation. That's
Nelda. O
not
sea,
what I'm
te lo estoy
saying.
diciendo
What I
pudiendo
was
tener
saying
muchas salidas
could be
finales.
understood in many
Todavía el
ways.
poder
And
se daba el
power
gusto de
was
jugar con
still
eso un
trying
poco
to
y
play around
buscaba
with
de la
that, and
lectura
they
que
would try
cogía
to select a
para no
reading,
matarte.
and in that way they wouldn't
Entonces
have
había
to
como otra
suppress
después los
you.
críticos increíblemente
Also,
premiaban
surprisingly, they would give us the
a lo mejor,
prizes,
digamos, o sea, había una
awards.
cuestión de
There
valorar la
was
calidad realmente, qué cosa es, debe
an
ser
interest in
sofisticado, bueno,
aesthetic
está
quality.
aportando algo
There was a
artísticamente
concern for
y
that
que además
still.
tiene un pensamiento autónomo, como dices tú, o sea, que está, y en todo
So
punto,
perhaps,
la seguridad de forma que te
sometimes
matan,
maybe the state
increíblemente
security, they
y
wanted to kill
amenazaban,
me. They
pero
would
de una
almost
manera
threaten
muy,
me, but
pero
they
después
would
entonces
did
los
it
críticos se reunían y nos
in a
daban los
way that was
premios,
very subtle. But
¿sabes?
then
Nos
on the
daban los
other
premios por las
hand, the
obras más
critics would give
polémicas.
us the
Entonces,
awards,
eso
and
nos
this
salvaba. Yo decía,
saved us.
el
I
crítico
always
me
said the
salva.
critics saved
Entonces
me.
después venían, habíamos muchos
At the
extranjeros
time,
viniendo como
many
muchos
foreigners were
políticos
coming to Cuba,
y
many
de pronto
producers,
esas obras tan
and
contestatarias dentro de Cuba se
suddenly
convertían en obras
these
muy
works, which were so
internacionales. Nosotros
difficult
hicimos
in
años de giras
Cuba, were acclaimed abroad. We often
El Pez de la
toured
Torre,
with El Pez
¿sabes?
de la
Obras
Torre and
con
other works,
Blanche, con
Blanche,
Fast Food,
Fast
toda esa
Food.
producción se giró
We
muchísimo,
toured
muchísimo
these
por toda Europa,
works
Estados
throughout
Unidos,
Europe, the
etcétera,
United States,
Norteamérica.
and Latin
Y eso
America. I
no
don't
creo que
think
esté pasando ahora
it's
de esta manera
happening
tampoco. Es muy raro. También el mundo
nowadays.
mismo ha
Also, the
sufrido mucho
world has
también con todo
changed
esto del
so much
coronavirus y tal.
and
Sino
suffered
la
so much from
interrelación
the
entre los
coronavirus. So,
países y
interaction
cómo el arte
between
fluye
the countries and the
internacionalmente
international flows of
se ha
art,
ido, ¿no? Bastante.
this has truly
Entonces,
slowed
bueno,
down.
pasaban esas cosas que te ponían a
So
flote. De
things would
pronto siempre
happen and they
había
would keep us
maneras
afloat.
de no pasarlo por la
Otherwise,
televisión, de no darte un
they wouldn't
local, de
want
no...
to present
Y
our
fue
work
claro,
on
yo estaba
TV.
muy
They
orgullosa
wouldn't
de estar
give us a
allá en el
place
MAD
to
porque
rehearse.
así me sentía mucho
But
más
I was fine with that
libre, ¿no?
because I
Pero
felt
igual hay un momento que te
a bit more
empiezas
free.
a
But at some
ahogar
point,
y
I
yo hubo
started
un
to feel
momento
that I
que no,
was
que me
choking.
voy del país, entre otras cosas
And
por problemas
eventually, I
políticos,
just
porque
decided to
quería
leave the
hacer otras
country,
cosas,
also for
cambiar
aesthetic
otro punto
reasons,
de
because I
vista,
wanted
no haciendo el mismo tema y la misma
to
cosa
work on different
que ya me
things. I
estaba, o
think
sea,
that
ya era un momento que
I
me
felt it
sentía
was the
la
same thing
coreógrafa
over
de la
and over. I
oposición, que a
was
mí no me
beginning to
gusta
feel
cuando
like I
me
was the
encierran
official
en cosas.
choreographer of the
Entonces empecé
opposition.
como, bueno, espérate,
And I
vamos a
don't like
buscar
to be
otros
put in a
horizontes.
cage, so I wanted
Me ha
to look
pasado una
for a
cosa
different
interesantísima,
horizon.
que
However, something
entrené
interesting has
tanto
happened to me.
la cosa de la simbiosis con la
I
realidad,
worked so hard
del criticismo,
at
de la
have
oposición,
being in symbiosis
del
with
gusto por la
reality,
censura, o
criticism.
sea, eso
At
hay
some
un momento que
point,
tú si no tienes eso,
I
es
almost, I
muy
would say, I
difícil crear.
relished
De
censorship.
donde
And
quiera
at
que yo
some
he
point, if
vivido,
you
yo
don't
siempre
have
sabes
that,
que
you
viví en
can't
Estados
create.
Unidos, que creé la compañía
So when I was living in the United States and I created the One Dance Action company, and in Dominican Republic I founded another company, but I can never avoid looking for something dangerous to talk about. For me, dance can never be something that's just cute. Oh, they dance so well. I have always, I feel that dance is regarded as harmless, something that does not require you to think or to engage. This is why I think that the main muscle in the body is the brain, and that we need to dance for the brain rather than for the body. So I'm not going to go into details because I've been working for 20 years out of Cuba. When I got to the United States, the Bush government administration was bombing Baghdad, and I was criticizing that and the moralism of American culture. And I also felt censorship. Then I went to Dominican Republic and I encountered so many issues with identity and power, misery and wealth. So I have continued working as I did when I was in Cuba. And of course, from an aesthetic point of view, I have always been trying to bring in different elements and running risks. So for instance, the work that I will present here, Anthropophobia, which I created during the pandemic, it has to do with the culture of obstacle, and I was involved in the project, in the obstacle project, the aesthetics of obstacles. So when you go to a different country, you need to reinvent yourself. You have to engage in symbiosis with different realities. And with the coronavirus, I was locked up at home. I had no dancers, I had no space. I started to film myself and I started to create choreographical videos, to produce video from the point of view of a choreographer. I had studied film and media arts in the United States because I was very interested in technology when I did my master's, because we had no technology in Cuba. So, but I was working on in video, but in the Cuban way, with cheap cameras, cheap small cameras, always with a very conceptual approach to the visual. After I had compiled 1 year of videos, I felt that I needed to make this virtual work something that could be presented. So I invited a Cuban dancer who has been in Dominican Republic for several years, co-founder of the national company with myself. And I suggested that we use these videos to create a score. I was posting them on social media. Would we then use the videos to create a performative structure, so to speak? And we brought her in. She was creating another choreography. So here she dances this part with me live. At that point, she couldn't. She also was alone. She had no company or dancers. She could only dance with me virtually because she was afraid of being infected. So this is a reflection about the virtual. Of course, the piece as a whole is about the anxiety of confinement, and this is why it's called Anthropophobia. That's me in my building using a GoPro camera. And we use the collective space in the building to present the work using video projections. So I have made other videos that I have sent to different festivals.
bueno, pues todo ese trabajo que además terminé enseñando en varias universidades en Latinoamérica, en
I
Estados
also
Unidos,
taught
lo
in.
que le llamo el
I
coreografía
ended
de
up
exposición. O sea,
teaching,
coreografía de
lecturing in
exposición.
different universities
Y eso
in
es
the United
fabuloso,
States and
eso es
Latin
fabuloso.
America about this idea of choreography via
Entonces,
Zoom,
nada,
choreography
creo
and
que
video.
con lo que está pasando ahora mismo es que es eso, que siempre estoy como uno, yo me siento como
So,
una
you know,
esponja,
this
o sea,
is,
que yo
it's always
absorbo
like this. I feel like I'm a
casi todo
sponge.
lo que me impresiona. Por eso cuando me
And
cambio
when
de
I
país
move
me
to a
encanta
different
también,
country, I
porque
love
entonces
it
ahí la
because then
esponja
the
se vuelve una
sponge
esponja
absorbs
buenísima
everything.
y empiezo a absorber todo. Que quería agradecer muchísimo
I
a
really
Tania
want
por esta
to thank
cosa
Tanya for this
maravillosa que
wonderful
ella ha hecho de
project
dictar que, que,
at
que yo le dije, tienes
Documenta.
que hacerlo
I've
todos
told her
los
you need to
años,
do the same every
aunque
year,
sea
at
una
least 1
semana,
week, 2
15 días,
weeks.
3 días. El
The
concepto está
concept is
muy
so
claro y es
clear
muy
and it's
necesario.
such a necessary
Entonces,
thing.
por favor,
So
vamos a
please,
poner
let's
todo
all
para que esto siga
contribute so
así,
that this can continue
porque
to
es muy
go on
importante,
because it
es
is
súper
super
importante
important.
lo que tú has
It's such a
logrado.
great achievement.
Sí, reafirmo lo
Yes,
que
I
dice
agree.
Marianela, creo que muchos lo reafirmarían. Marianela, bueno, en los tiempos de Cuba tú siempre fuiste como la liberadora
Okay,
del cuerpo, ¿no? En el
Marianela,
sentido de
in Cuba,
luchar
you were
contra todo
always
tipo
the
de
one who was
resignificamiento
fighting to
corporal
liberate
desde el
the
ballet
body
clásico
against the
cubano, ¿no?
restrictions of
Y
Cuba's
con danza
classical
abierta también,
ballet.
ir a ver cuerpos
When you
que
had
existían,
danza
¿no? Que podían
abierta, we would
moverse,
go to
¿no?
see existing,
Exacto,
moving
gente
bodies
reales,
and
¿no?
real people.
Entonces creo que
So
ese
I think
trabajar
that
siempre contra el
your work
disciplinamiento
against disciplining,
que tiene que ver con la rigidez de los
against the
cuerpos
rigidities that are
es muy
imposed on the
revolucionario
bodies, well, how did
desde
you
que lo estudio,
experience
¿no?
the
Y de aislamiento
confinement and
corporal.
isolation
Es
during
maravilloso tus
the
propuestas, tus
pandemic?
reinvenciones.
This
No he
reinvention that
leído
you
más,
produced
o
is
sea, yo no he
amazing.
perdido eso. Si no existe el
Yes,
impedimento,
I
yo
always have to work
quedarme
against
sin pintura de
constraints.
Cuba,
Where there are
absolutamente.
no constraints,
Porque es
I
un
beat
poco
them
eso la
up.
estética
And
del
that's a bit what
obstáculo.
the aesthetics of obstacle is about.
O la resistencia, como dice Nelda. Bueno, hemos dejado para el
Okay,
final el momento más
we will
complejo quizás, ¿no?
maybe
Por la
end
complejidad
with
desde
the
el
most
lugar que
complex
trabajan.
moment because
Nelda
Nelda
Castillo y
Castillo and
Mariela,
Mariela are working out of a very
creo que son
complex
así dos
place.
figuras de
They
referencia
are
muy
two really
importantes
important
para pensar
figures
cómo se produce
to
desde Cuba,
think
cómo seguir
how
siendo una
you
persona
can
cívica,
produce, how you
¿no?
can continue to
En el
be a
espacio
civic
cubano,
person in Cuba,
cómo ustedes encarnen
how
eso,
you
encarnan esa
embody that
condición
civic
cívica de
condition
personas que
of
luchan por
people
sus
who are
derechos
fighting for
desde el
their
espacio
rights
público, que
in
para ustedes es el
the
espacio
public space,
artístico, el
which
espacio
for
poético.
you is an artistic,
Hay
poetic
algo muy
space.
importante en el trabajo del
Something
siervo, más
very
allá de poder
important about the
conversar.
work
¿Cómo
of El
ustedes
Siervo
encarnan, ¿no?
Encantado.
Esta experiencia
I
encarnada de
would
la que
like
hemos
to ask,
hablado,
how
la
do you
posibilidad de
embody
pensar una
the
autonomía o cómo
possibility
luchar
of
por una
thinking
independencia
autonomy or
pese a
fighting for
formar parte de una
independence, even though
institución,
you are
¿no? En
part of an
relación a que tienen
institution?
un
I'm trying to
espacio,
say
pertenecen a una
you have
práctica
a space,
institucional, son
you are
prearmadas, todo
acknowledged
lo que
by the
implica, ¿no?
institutions,
Pertenecer
you in a
a
sense
un espacio
belong
institucional
to
y
the
cómo ustedes
institutional space of Cuban
lidian con
culture.
eso,
How do
¿no?
you
Y
deal
su
with that?
trabajo responde sobre todo a un espacio de gran
Because
libertad de
your work is
pensamiento,
a
de
space
gran
where there
libertad
is
de
extreme
creación,
liberty of
de
thought
gran
and
libertad en los
creation.
recursos, digo yo, así lo
That's how
veo,
I
pero
perceive
ustedes
it.
dirán en los recursos
You
estéticos,
have great
¿no?
freedom in your use of
Saben de
aesthetic
las luchas por la
resources.
política,
We
por
know, of
ejemplo,
course, that you
pero
don't have
creo
a
que
lot of
todas las estrategias
financial
políticas desde
resources,
las
but at
cuales
least from an
están
aesthetic point of
creando,
view,
el Siervo Encantado no es solo
El
el
Siervo
trabajo
Encantado
más
is
teatral,
not
performativo que se
maybe
conoce en el espacio de presentación de
among
ustedes, sino
El Siervo
me
Encantado
gustaría
is not
mucho que
only the
quizás
proper stage work
pudieran
that you
hablar de
produce,
las acciones,
you
de
also organize
intervenciones
actions and
que
interventions
realizan en el
in public
espacio
space,
público, ¿no? Y que tienen que
and
ver con
which
comentarios de la
are
vida
commentaries
cotidiana
on everyday
de
life
Cuba,
in
¿no?
Cuba.
¿Cómo ha sido para
How
ustedes
has that been
también
like for you
trabajar
working
desde ahí, ¿no?
in a different
Activarse
space
como
to you've
artistas, como
activated
sujetos
yourselves as
cívicos,
artists
¿no?
and
Desde
civic
ese espacio, desde esos
subjects
escenarios, pues más
by
expuestos,
using
podríamos decir,
public
¿no?
space
Para
where you are a
hacer
bit more
las distintas
exposed?
acciones que son
And
quizás
these
menos
actions are
conocidas,
maybe
pero
not
me
as well
parecen
known as your plays, but
esenciales
I think that
en
they
lo que
are
sería la representación del
a crucial
trabajo
component of your
de
work.
ustedes y del siervo.
Sí. El siervo,
Right.
desde sus
El
inicios,
Siervo, from the start,
empieza en una base bastante de incomodidad y de resistencia.
we always worked out
Porque
of a
yo,
place of
desde el primer buen día,
discomfort
con el
and
grupo
resistance.
que
I
he
was
conocido y
in another
en el
group
año
that was
90, era
fairly
algo muy
well known
especial.
during the
Tenía el
1990s.
privilegio de viajar hasta
Back
3
in
veces
during
al
this
mundo,
special period, we had
porque
the privilege of traveling even 3 times a year,
participaba
I was
como
an actress
actriz
there,
y como
and I was
directora
artistic
artística.
director.
Tenía una obra
I had a
incluso
work that
viajó,
even
se puso en
toured.
Covent Garden y viajó por todo
It
el
went
mundo.
to Covent Gardens and everywhere in the world,
Cuando
all around
me
the
di cuenta
world.
que también que estaba haciendo de
At
alguna
some point, I
manera
realized that
restrictada,
I
que
was
tenía que trabajar con
being,
mis compañeros actores, que tenía que esperar que terminara un
I
proyecto,
was a bit
verlo o
restrained.
grabarlo,
I had to
entonces tenía que
work
esperar
for my
mucho
peers to finish
y
their own projects.
nos fuimos, Carlos y
And
yo,
so then
para
Carlos
comenzar
and
algo
I
nuevo. Y yo me
split
fui
to
a la
create
revista
a new group.
como estudiantes
First, I
que yo había
just
tenido en el
started working with
92,
some students,
3 de
3
ellos,
students
y nos
in
fuimos para la
1992, and we
calle,
started
no
working on the
teníamos dónde
streets. We
estar,
didn't have a place to
y
work,
buscamos los
and we
sótanos
were
de las
trying
iglesias
to
de Carolina del
use church
Centre,
basements
y a las 5 de la tarde, o ya cuando
at
terminaba
5
todo, en misa,
p.m.
porque
when
había una actriz
classes were over at
que se
the
desnudó y se metió a la
ISA
tierra,
because there was an
se enteraba que
actress who
teníamos que
got
andar como
naked
brujas de
and
un lugar a
covered
otro,
herself in dirt, so we
y
need
así
to do it, find
hicimos
for a
El
place to
Ciervo
work.
Encantado. Pero El
And
Ciervo
this is how we
Encantado, su
created El
tesis
Ciervo
es la cacería de
Encantado.
la libertad,
Our
la
thesis
cacería
is
de la
a hunt
identidad.
for
Por lo tanto,
freedom and
era
identity.
mantener a ese
Therefore,
grupo
this
que además no
group
teníamos, todavía no
that was
teníamos el
still not
proyecto,
still
era
yet conceived as a
presentar
project,
que ellos
we
se
were
graduaran con
the
El
idea is
Ciervo
that they would
Encantado, y no
graduate with
teníamos
El
espacio
Ciervo
hasta
Encantado.
que dimos
We
con
didn't have a space until we found
almacén
a
Elisa,
storage
que
space
era
at the
como un
ISA, the Art
búnker,
Institute. It
que
was
era,
like a bunker,
iba a ser el
and
aula
it
de
was going to
producción
be
de
a screening
socorro
room
para la Facultad de Artes
for the
Plásticas,
plastic
pero nunca se
arts
convirtió en aula
department,
y
and
poco a poco fue un
but it
almacén,
never
era basura.
was
Durante
used as
20
a
años basura. Y nosotros fuimos allí
classroom,
en
and
base
it
a
was
una
filled with
maestra,
trash. And a
Lupe
teacher,
Álvarez,
Lupe
y
Alvarez,
dijo,
told us,
ustedes quieren participar en
"You
la
want to be in
Bienal,
the
que
biennial."
decía, se me llamaba el hombre, ¿no? No sé,
What was
el sentido no sé qué cosa, del
the
hombre,
title of
no
the
recuerdo
event
bien el
was
título, y queríamos
something
poner
of
El
man
Ciervo
or something like
Encantado
that, and
en
we wanted to
ese
present
contexto de la Bienal. No estábamos
El
invitados porque
Ciervo
las Bienales siempre las
Encantado. In that
montábamos,
context, they
y
hadn't
limpiamos aquel
invited
hueco,
us.
que era como cuando tú
We
llegas, era como un
cleaned
hueco
up
así
that
con
hole. It was
escaleras
like, you went
y
down these
los
stairs.
aires
It
y
was like
todo,
a
todo
hole filled
basura.
with trash.
Pero esto con escaleras, haciendo un
The
trabajo corporal tan fuerte que hacíamos, teníamos
Since
que
there were
subir
these
con escaleras. Y la gente
stairs
la conocía
everywhere,
porque
we had
buscaba
to do
escalera arriba y
difficult body
escalera
work.
abajo.
How are we
Y
going to
dijimos,
do it?
vamos
We said,
subiendo
well,
de
it's going to be
basura.
like
A partir de ahí,
Battleship Potemkin,
estábamos en un
stairs up,
lugar
stairs
que
down.
era una
We
institución
filled
donde
up
era
3
Elisa,
garbage
un
trucks.
grupo profesional. Y ahí estábamos muy
And so
incómodos
we were
porque
at the
no éramos
ISA. We
corrientes,
felt
no
really,
teníamos
it was
baños
really
porque nosotros
uncomfortable.
ahí
We
no
had
podíamos,
no
como los baños
electricity. There
estaban
were no restrooms
inutilizables,
because they
y
could
con
not be
un
used.
cable, y ahí empezamos. Nosotros tuvimos 11 años
Uh,
en
and
ese
we worked
búnker,
for 11
en ese
years in
búnker de
that
Elisa,
bunker.
que decía, bueno, un espacio, no, eso era luchado, porque cada vez
We
que
had fought
cambiaban el
for that
decano,
space
decían,
because
pues ustedes son
whenever there was
profesionales, ¿qué
a
hacen
new
aquí?
dean,
Pero cada vez
uh,
que
they would
visitaba la
say, "You are
escuela
you're a
una
professional group.
personalidad
Why are you here
como,
at the art school?"
¿cómo se llama
But whenever
Arthur Miller
people came
o
from abroad,
Danny
like
Glover,
when
a quien
Arthur Miller
visitaban? Le
came or
llamaban,
Danny Glover,
ellos son los cantantes. Poníamos
they
ahí,
would
y
they
decían,
would
qué estudiantes más
they would
avanzados, y
present
éramos
our
nosotros.
work, and the
Claro, y en
visitors
un
would
lugar
say, "Oh, these
impresionante,
students
que no
are
tenían
so advanced,"
identificación.
but
Ahí
it was
estuvimos
actually
11 años.
us.
En una ocasión, Abel
One
Prieto
time,
entró
Abel Prieto
para
walked in
vernos,
to see us and
estar
to
ahí,
be there,
y por poco
and
se
he
ahoga. Y
almost
esto tuvo que estar aquí, porque allá estuvimos 11 años.
suffocated because
Y
there
de
was no
ahí mismo
ventilation,
partimos
and
en
we were
hacer
there for many
ese
years.
teatro que era investigativo de las raíces de Cuba escondida,
So our aim
incluyendo a
was to
Severo Sarduy,
investigate the roots of
Reinaldo
Cuba,
Arenas, a
and we
Guillermo Cabrera
discovered Severo
Infante,
Sarduy, Guillermo Cabrera
y a
Infante,
partir de
Reinaldo
nosotros, la
Arenas.
escuela fue
And
descubriendo
through
también a
us,
Severo
the
Sarduy, que
school
se
also
empezó a
started
dar
to discover their work.
en artes
They
plásticas, o
started
sea,
to
en las
teach
clases
Severo
de plástica.
Sarduy
Severo Sarduy,
in the plastic
que
arts
nosotros repartíamos
department.
allí a los plásticos
We
de
would
dónde son
give
los
them
cantantes, que hicieron
his work,
performance
De dónde son los
con máscaras con
cantantes.
nosotros, y empezamos a introducir todos esos valores
We
nacionales.
started to
No, estaban
reintroduce
censurados,
these
no,
national
no se
values, the
conocían.
work of
Nuestro
artists
programa
who had been
ponía
censored
a
and were not
Cabrera
known.
Infante, o sea, era
Cabrera
importante,
Infante, for
porque era
example,
el
was
título
important for us.
era el monólogo de Tres Tristes
It was a
Tigres
monologue. We staged a
del
monologue
abusador del
from his
cabaret.
novel Tres
Y
Tristes
Cabrera Infante
Tigres,
estaba vivo todavía.
and
Y
the author
nunca
was
nos
still
escuchó.
alive.
Tenemos el
We sent him the video, but it seems that he didn't want to communicate with us. And even back then, we started to create public interventions because we would present the show at the bunker, but at the same time, we created an intervention when they started the little war about emails, when people were discussing what we called the gray 5 years. Back then, we organized an intervention during the panel. The school was already empty because students couldn't be there, and there was a debate at the events room, and there was just a panel there and a few guests or victims of the gray 5 years. Maria was using a mask and she started to do an intervention. Someone else had a sign and a costume filled with the beer cans. What do you call them? Pieces of cardboard. And she was saying that she would trade her salary of 600 Cuban pesos. She would exchange her salary. There was a pianist with books by Reinaldo Arenas, Severo Sarduy, and so you were selling cigars, coffee, and she went up to the panel. The jury was there, the guy from culture, etc., and she started selling them cigars and showing them the books that she had by Reinaldo Arenas, etc. So even then, we started to do these public interventions while we also worked at the bunker. And so we continued to work in parallel. Then we moved to another dumpster at 5th and D, another abandoned place. There were also no restrooms, but because there we did have access to an audience because people couldn't really make it to the ISA. And when they didn't know that there was any theater there. So at this new location, we also continued to work on public interventions. And when we had the new guidelines, when those arrived, Mariela, she had this character, a saleswoman, and one time during the book fair, what's it called? And she came in character, completely transformed. Because after there were the new guidelines, you had these mutants. There were these characters who were salespeople. It was like a sudden mutation. And there were kind of monsters wearing garish, cheap clothes. And she went into that event called Drama of the Revolution, and she was in character, and she set up a little shop, a little stall.
Bueno, en el sentido o sea, de la charla que hemos tenido en cuanto a lo autónomo y la relación con la
Well, since we're talking about autonomy and relationship to the institutions, I think that artists and institutions are always like oil and water. Institutions are there to set limits, and artists are there to break those limits, to transgress them. So in our case, we work in a very unconscious manner, I would say, with regard to the institution. For us, these spaces are ours, even if they are institutional spaces. No matter if it's a very small space or a proper space like the one we're using now, nonetheless, we regard it as our theater. As long as we are there, it's ours and of the people we invite to work with us. We are more obsessed with keeping the space going than with maintaining our own households. We are there all the time. And so we enter into a creative dimension. And of course, there, institutions have no say, or the person who is employing you. We are working in response to an issue, an obsession, something that we want to investigate and communicate. And then the reaction from the institution, that's a different problem. We never work worried about what the institution agrees, whether the institution will agree or not. So of course we have had to deal with repercussions. Of course there have been consequences, and there is a struggle, there is a push and pull with institutions. Sometimes it's more relaxed, sometimes it's more tense. And this is strategically how we have been able to manage to survive, because we want to exist. We want the space to go on existing, not simply for ourselves as individual artists, but also because the audience needs it, not only to see our work, but also the work of other people who we have an opportunity to present and promote, especially work from younger artists who have lost access to space or who have no visibility. There they can experiment, try things out. And for many people in Cuban society, this is a necessary space. So we are in a situation of ongoing constant resistance. We continue to do what we want to do as we want to do it, and simultaneously we are trying to protect and to come up with strategies and negotiating. Often the negotiations are uncomfortable, but we will engage in them. At that point, we try to be very conscious and aware of the risks entailed by this will to continue going on in spite of everything that we know happens in Cuba. So when Tanya was speaking, I also remembered my own experiences. I am in Tanya's generation, and for me, it was really important as a kind of a civic education. At stage when I was a student at the ISA, the Art Institute, we shared a moment there that was very effervescent artistically and socially, especially in the fields of the plastic arts and theater. And we experienced, for example, the fourth wall, the emergence of Teatro Buen Dia, which is the first project that emerged out of a need, and it gave rise to an important argument. It was really difficult because before, everyone who graduated from the ISA would join an established group, but then she decided to create a new group, and it was a hard-fought battle, but she was able to do it. And so that was the first project, even before the National Council for the Stage Arts existed. This was approved by the Ministry of Culture. And Buendia, this project was a school. We were there all the time. And Flor, the director, would invite artists who were out on the streets, and you could only see their work there in this small shows that she would organize sometimes. That's where Carlos Varela first performed his music in public. The magazine or journal called Albur, which I contributed to, which was created independently by drama students. The El Sinor Festival, all of this happened at the time. So we learned a lot during that time. And we became very aware that we were part of something else. We were not just studying acting or theater studies. There were many interdisciplinary connections, and there was a lot going on. These urges to made us feel the need to continue on that path. Later on, when we created El Ciervo, in addition to the research that we do for our stage plays, in parallel, we always felt the need to intervene in urgent, ongoing national debates. We wanted to go there and share our opinion in an immediate way, and this is how we started to organize public interventions and performances in public spaces. We have brought these are two or three examples. This was during the last Havana Biennial. It's a piece called Floating Islands. And we did it outside what used to be the house of Dulce Maria Loinaz, and it's a work. Floating Islands is the name of a recipe for a Cuban sweet, a dessert. The mask
una natilla muy ligera que lleva unos merengues flotantes así. Entonces, esta
so the
máscara es una
mask
cajita como un
has a little
tesoro con
treasure
muchas
box
recetas,
with
que es una
many
herencia que
recipes.
yo
It's an
recibí de mi
inheritance that I
familia, de mi
received from
abuela,
my
mi madre, mi
family,
bisabuela, de todas las
my mother,
recetas
grandmother, and great
de
grandmother,
ellas que se fueron
all of their
entrenadas para ser amas
recipes,
de
who
casa.
they were all trained
Entonces
to be
yo hice una
housewives.
selección de todas esas
So
recetas
I made a
cubanas, de
selection of
comida
Cuban
cubana, y
recipes,
eso es lo que llevo en esa
and this
cajita.
is
En
what
el
I
momento
have in the
determinado
box. And at some
saco esos
point, I
papelitos
take out
y
the
los
pieces of
lanzo al aire,
paper
y
and
las
I cast
personas
them up
están
in the
alrededor
air, and the
agarrando esa
people
receta. Y son
catch
recetas
them in the air. And
de la cocina cubana, lo que pasa
these
es que
are
son
Cuban
impreparables en
recipes
este
that you
momento.
cannot cook
Entonces
right
ahí
now.
estaba como la tensión
So
del
that was the
ejercicio, ¿no?
tension.
Y entonces, exacto, entonces es como a vista así de ya en una distancia,
So seen
un ejercicio
in the rearview
muy
mirror, I regard it as an exercise
perturbador
that
y
was
así
upsetting.
triste
It was
en última instancia también, ¿no?
sad
Porque
ultimately because
hay una belleza, hay una
there's a
epifanía,
beauty,
estamos
there's an
describiendo y
epiphany.
hablando de algo que es
We're
nuestro
talking about something
y
that
al
is
mismo tiempo una
ours, and
imposibilidad.
yet there is impossibility.
Este es otra acción que
This
hicimos
is
en el
another
año
action that we did in
2017. Esta es
2017.
el pedestal que sostenía la estatua de Estrada Palma, el primer presidente de Cuba, de la República. Y
This is the place
fue
where
los
the
días en
statue
que
of Cuba's first
se
president
eligió el
used
nuevo
to
presidente
stand.
de
And at
Cuba.
the time,
Entonces
Cuba's
nosotros
new
hicimos esta
president was
intervención que se llama
elected.
el cuerpo de esos
And
zapatos,
we made
porque
this intervention
cuando el
called
triunfo de la
the
revolución
body of
esa estatua
these
fue
shoes
derribada,
because that
pero los
statue
zapatos
was
se
knocked
quedaron
down
prendidos en el
when the
pedestal y
revolution
quedaban unos
won,
pedacitos
but
de zapatos. Y
the
eso se ha
shoes
mantenido.
remained.
Esa la Avenida de los
This
Presidentes
is
es una avenida
President's
donde estaban
Avenue.
todos los presidentes de
All
la
of the
República
presidents of the Republic
distintos
used
pedazos
to
del
be
parque.
there along that
Y
avenue.
en todos esos pedazos han sido suplidas por otros
And
presidentes
all of those statues
latinoamericanos.
have been
Pero
replaced by other
de manera
presidents, Latin American
intrigante
presidents.
para nosotros,
But in
esta
a
que es la del
mysterious
primer
way,
presidente
according to
nunca fue
us, the
sustituida
statue of the
por
first
ninguna otra
Cuban
figura.
president was
Pero
never
estaban esos
replaced by
zapatos
another
ahí hasta el
image,
año
but the
pasado,
shoes
que fue
remained
intervenida y fue
until last year.
remodelada. Entonces ya todos los zapatos y todo eso fue como restaurado, y en la restauración
It's all been restored,
desapareció el
and
vestigio de ese presidente, que
they
quedaron, eran solo
removed
los zapatos.
all the
Entonces en ese
remaining
momento que
traces
fueron
of
las
that
elecciones,
statue, namely the shoes. So back
ya
then, when the
el nuevo
president was
presidente
elected, the
de
new
Cuba
president
ahora,
was elected,
nosotros hicimos esta expresión que se llama el cuerpo de esos
we
zapatos.
did an
Y la
intervention
intervención
called the
consistía
body of
en
those shoes.
convocar a las
And
personas
what we did was
que habíamos
we
reunido allí
invited
a que
people
propusieran a quién pondrían en ese pedestal.
to suggest who
Y
they would
entonces
place
ahí
on
en
that
esos papelitos
pedestal.
que
So in
que
those
yo iba
small pieces of
llenando,
papers, which I
iba
would
como
fill out,
entrevistando a todos
I
los
would
presidentes y ellos me
interview
iban diciendo
the people who
a
came,
quién
and they would
pondrían
tell
ahí.
me who they
Y
would
bueno,
put there.
ahí fue cada
Each
persona
person
ponía ahí, no sé, a
would
su madre, a su
name,
perro,
their
a un
mother,
amigo,
their
a un
dog, a friend,
artista,
an artist,
a un
an
conocido, a una persona
acquaintance,
admirada por
someone
ellos
they
y que
admired,
consideraban que
who
merecía
they
estar
thought
allí.
should be up on that
Entonces luego yo
pedestal.
pegaba,
And
todos
then
esos
I
papelitos
would
fueron pegados ahí y muchos
glue the
estaban en
pieces of
blanco.
paper,
Yo
and
dejé
many
muchos papelitos
were
pegados en
blank.
blanco para
I
que
left many
luego
blank pieces of
subieran
paper there so
al
that people
pedestal
could climb up
y siguieran escribiendo
and continue to add
otras personas
the
que
names of
iban
other
llegando.
people.
Entonces esta fue esa intervención en... Exacto, entonces eso, bueno, fue un trabajo que generó otro trabajo después, porque bueno, fue
This
una
led to
intervención
another
pública.
work because that was a public intervention.
Y esta fue una
And
intervención que
this is an
hicimos
intervention that we did.
bueno, fue la entrega del
This
catálogo
is when they
de Premio Nacional de Artes
presented the
Plásticas a Lázaro
catalog
Saavedra.
for the
Y
National
entonces
Award
eso fue
for
en
the
el LAN,
Plastic
iba a
Arts.
ser la
They were
presentación del
going to
catálogo
present the
de
catalog,
la obra de Lázaro, que ese año
a catalog of Lazaro's work. That
nombrado
year,
Premio
he
Nacional de
was
Artes Plásticas,
he won
y
the
nosotros hicimos esa
prize, the national
intervención
prize.
para entregarle a
And
Lázaro
in our
bueno, con este
intervention, we
personaje
wanted
que es itinerante y que
to
interviene
give him.
en cuanta reunión hay,
This is a character.
que se llama Chela
We had
Cuesta
this character
Arriba.
Chela Cuesta Arriba, who helped
No,
all
el video
kinds
no.
of
La foto anterior.
official events.
Esto es un diploma que entregaba Stalin al artista
So
del
this was
premio.
a diploma that Stalin would
Esta
deliver, would give
compañera
to the
que
people's artists.
interviene en
And
espacios
so this is a character
institucionales
who
o
is a
no,
compañera
pero con un
who
discurso
walks
muy
into
ortodoxo.
institutional spaces
Y
and
en este caso ella
speaks using a
fue
very
como una
orthodox
especie
discourse.
de
So this
felicitación a
time
Lázaro
she was
Saavedra por
there
el Premio
to
Nacional de Artes
congratulate
Plásticas y hacer
Lázaro
todo
Saavedra
una
for
biografía
receiving
de Lázaro
the
Saavedra,
award.
y al final entregamos el cuadro
And then at
que
the end, we gave him
el diploma que
this
entregaba Stalin al
framed
artista del pueblo.
poster, which is a
Aunque
copy
la próxima semana
of
lo mandaron para
the
Siberia,
diploma
pero
that
ese
Stalin
era
would
el
give
diploma. Entonces
to
hicimos
the
una
artist who
exposición
won the
ahí
People's Artist Prize,
al
even though
diploma
1
y
week
se lo
later they
entregamos.
might have
Entonces
sent them to
esta
Siberia.
performance, ahí está Lázaro con
So
dos
here
funcionarios,
you
está el
see
catálogo, no
Lázaro,
puede
you
ver
see the
el
catalog, and you
catálogo
see two
de la
government
obra en sí.
officials.
Y entonces
And
entregamos el
so we
diploma al
gave
artista del
him
pueblo
the
Lázaro, porque
diploma
además el premio estaba entregado en un contexto que fue
because
muy
also it
interesante
was a very
y de mucha tensión
interestingly tense
a
situation
nivel
this time
artístico,
when the
político
award was
civil. Tanto en nuestra obra de sala,
given.
digamos,
As
más
for
particular, como
our
en
stage
esta
work,
fase de los performances y las intervenciones públicas, o la cátedra de performer, que es un espacio pedagógico y de presentación que
we
tenemos,
also
es
have a
donde
pedagogical space that we call
invitamos
the
a
performer
colaboración,
lectureship, and
intercambios
we invite
o
people
representación a
to
estos artistas
uh,
mayormente jóvenes,
young
emergentes,
artists to
o
be
no
part
tan
of
jóvenes, pero que no
exchanges
tienen
or emerging
visibilidad o
artists
posibilidad de
or
exponer sus
artists
obras
who have
y
no
que
other
tienen que
spaces
ver
to
a
present their
nivel
work.
de lenguaje y de pensamiento conceptual o artístico en general con nuestras líneas de
People
trabajo.
who we feel a relation
Entonces
to
son como los
conceptually
tres
or artistically.
caminos, ¿no?
So
Por
these are
donde
all
el
our
grupo ha
3 lines of
avanzado en
work.
ese sentido. Hay otro para terminar,
So
que es
to
como un
conclude,
videíto que
there's a
hicimos
brief
con
video
Chela
that
también,
we did also with
que
this character, Chela.
es esta lady de la que se ha comentado antes. Y ese es un pequeño video que hicimos de una
It's a brief video
interviniendo
where we are doing an
en
intervention
la
on a
calle,
graffiti
también en un
in the
momento en que el
streets at a
graffiti
time
fue
when
muy perseguido y estos
graffiti
artistas
was
fueron
persecuted and graffiti
amenazados,
artists
censurados.
were threatened and
Y
censored.
entonces, entre las cosas que
So
hicimos
we
a
did
favor
something
y como manera
to
de
defend them,
apoyar y
to support
proteger la
them
obra
and
de
their
estos
work.
artistas, una de las acciones que hicimos,
We did
y
an
también
action
para dar nuestra opinión sobre la
also to
349,
say what we thought
fue esta
about the
intervención que se
decree
llama
349. We created an intervention called
No sé si sale el video.
En el cursillo intensivo para supervisores e inspectores del Ministerio de Cultura. Debo decirle que yo, disculpen
Entonces,
la falta de
nada, las gracias.
Pero esto me
Ha sido
emociona.
de verdad un privilegio inmenso estar en
Yo he sido
este
seleccionada.
encuentro. Porque,
So I
bueno,
want to
además de
thank
la
you. It's been a
connotación
privilege
que
to be part of
tiene
this panel,
Documenta a nivel mundial
not
como
only
la
because
plaza de arte
Documenta is
o
such
sea,
an
el
important
encuentro del
art event,
encuentro,
but we have an
INSTAR ha logrado
encounter.
esto,
Inside that encounter,
que
INSTAR
es
has created
como lo más valioso,
this
que
incredibly
nos
valuable
reencontremos
space for
y que
us to
tengamos un
meet
espacio de
again and
comunicación
to communicate
tan tan importante
This is
y
so important
tan
and
saludable.
so healthy.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Vamos a ver si sale el video.
Como le decía, yo no estoy sola. Cientos de miles, millones de compañeros a todo lo largo y ancho del país se están preparando.
El video todavía se ve la pantalla en negro.
Para hacer el parte.
Sí, un espacio de rememoración, además, ¿no? Necesitamos recordar.
This is also a space to remember. We need to retain the memory of everything that has been done and continues to be done.
No sé si tú al final ahorita quieres decir algo, pero en esta conversación sobre
I think that during this conversation about autonomy and independence,
que estamos hablando en un espacio de, creo, de
I feel that we are speaking from a liminal space, a space of negotiations, circumstantial, contingent negotiations. All of these spaces are negotiating the crevices between the institutions and retaining the right to imagine and resist, which is something that a space that art always creates for us. I don't know, Tanya, if you want to add something to conclude.
Sí, a ver, no te escuchamos. Para escuchar a Tania, a ver si otra vez se soluciona el audio, Tania. No te estamos escuchando.
Sí,
un minutito.
Ahora me escucho. Sí.
Un minutito, sí. Sí, porque quizás esto es un tema, Tania, que lo podamos seguir abordando.
Maybe this is something that we can continue discussing. We have to keep thinking about this. It's not a closed issue. We have to consider particular circumstances. Hold on, because we can't hear you yet.
Estamos viendo a ver cómo te escuchamos. Espérate, te aviso. A ver, todavía.
No me escuchan. Bueno.
¿No? A ver, habla.
Sí, hola.
¿No tienes nada cerrado en tu micrófono o algo? ¿No? No.
Ahora me
¿Tania?
escuchan ahora.
No, se sigue sin escuchar. Qué pena. Es que ahorita se solucionó. Pero ahora no. Qué pena. ¿No creen que se pueda solucionar?
It seems that it's not possible to get Tanya's audio working again.
Bueno, Tania, qué pena. Nos estás escuchando, pero no te podemos escuchar.
It's terrible, Tanya. You can hear us, but we cannot hear you. And I'm sorry about that, because it would have been so important to hear what you have to say. You've created this space for conversation.
Una conversación es un diálogo, ¿no? Entonces nos quedamos pendientes con la posibilidad de seguir conversando.
So hopefully we will be able to continue talking. But we do want to thank you.
¿Sí? ¿Me escuchas?
No sé. Bueno, pues muchas gracias. El video no se puede poner. Tampoco se escucha. No, bueno, ni el audio de Tania ni el video se puede escuchar. ¿Qué bichito se metió en la pantalla? Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, de verdad, un lujazo poder conversar. Gracias de todo corazón.
Yo quería decir una cosita.
Thank you so much. I did want to say one thing. I want to thank you, Ileana, for your work, and hopefully you will continue working with all of us from a distance, because what you've written about autonomous art, I find it fascinating. And you have analyzed this in a way that is very useful for us in Cuba, right? So you please continue
Bueno, yo pienso
writing,
invitarte para allá para que veas todo.
I'm going to
Veas
invite
donde
you.
pero además ya no hace falta eso. Eso ya comunicamos todo por
Or
virtualidad.
maybe we don't,
Muchas
that's
gracias,
not
Víctor.
necessary anymore. We can communicate virtually, but I want to thank you as well. Yes, and we will keep going, right? This is what happens when Mariela brings out the box and she shares those recipes, and people get crazy trying to grab these recipes as if and it's a way of sublimating desire, and it's the same. This kind of encounter is the same for us. We are sublimating so many things, all of the nostalgia and so many wishes. Thank you.
Tania, querida, adiós.
Gracias.
Hasta
Adiós,
pronto,
adiós.
gracias. Te abrazamos en la distancia.